Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I'm a fan of classic movies.
During the spookiest time of the year, there are a few guidelines all ghosts and goblins should follow. Always stay on sidewalks. Never go to a stranger's house. And never go out alone.
I'm the boogeyman. And I'm coming to get you.
You know nothing of hell.
Fear flicker.
I'm tired of living in fear.
I'm back.
New to the neighborhood.
Trick or treat!
Trick or treat!
If you are thinking of seeing this film alone, don't.
Julia, let's get this show on the road.
Hello and welcome to Overlapping Dialogue, a podcast of double features dedicated to programming the finest, most eclectic, and downright bizarre film pairings and cataloging the discussions that ensue. We're your gruesome twosome, Kyle and Levi Huffman. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Levi.
And here we are.
It's time to get that show on the road.
Yeah. So, a lot of stuff going on with this episode. This is obviously our 61st episode. Obviously, that's a new intro you just heard. We're obviously in the maiden voyage of this episode of debuting our new format, where we're not going to be doing any audio commentaries, but instead just general discussions of two films that we find to be important or worthy enough to warrant what we would call a double feature, so to speak, a pairing. Now, this week is going to be much more obvious in what that pairing is and how they relate to one another with George Romero's two zombie classics, Night of the Living Dead from 1968 and his film 10 years later. It's not exactly a sequel, but part of the series of sorts, Dawn of the Dead from 1978. And obviously you just heard the intro. We're back to, Spooktober Spooktacular. So,
Scott Bakula.
He should, Scott Dracula. It needs to happen.
Yeah.
Well,
it did.
One day. Yeah.
Well, it was Scott Ackerman on
Comedy Bing Bong.
Comedy Bing Bong.
So, obviously, we're in a new format. Any thoughts or ideas, Levi, about what this format means for us moving forward?
Well, I mean, it'll just be a little bit simpler where we're going to talk a little bit more about the plots specifically sometimes because we're not going to be doing the movies themselves. We'll kind of it'll be most of the same as far as the way we talk about the themes and the making of them and those sort of things. It'll be a lot like what we already do, just a little bit of a different version of it, I think.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, we're going to be finding our footing with this new format, so to speak. So, we're going to be experimenting with a format. We think it's going to work this week, but obviously next week we'll go to the old
because next week's
board
double feature. Oh boy,
yeah, oh boy, you
guess what part of it would be?
No chance,
and then there's no way you're going to
stay tuned to the very end to see what that is. But Levi, we've got the ghosts and goblins gathered around. You know what time it is? We just gotta get into our Blue Plate Special.
Hi, Audrey. Mama, have a cup of coffee, please. Sure.
I'll have what she's having.
Hey, who wants a large pepperoni? Coming up!
put that popcorn ball down now.
You imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger like hosting a kid's Halloween party, just like how he would react.
Put it down.
We haven't really seen Arnold tackle many horror movies,
Yeah, I feel like we need to do his version of Who Be Halloween, but like first of all, good. Second, well, that implies that Arnold Schwarzenegger's been all that great anyway ever, but we love him, but
to that point, him and Adam Sandler should team up and do something together. What would that even be? Look
I'm
like?
good.
Levi just says no.
I'm just saying. No.
So our discussion this week of our Blue Plate special items, it's kind of funny. We didn't plan it this way. These two movies could themselves be a double feature, actually, we're about to talk about. Two new releases, hot off the presses of Hollywood. This is the latest Hollywood has to offer. Don't Worry, Darling.
Not the offer.
No. No, that's what Hollywood had to offer 6 months ago.
In the White Room, yeah. But anyway.
Don't Worry, Darling, from this year, recently released from director Olivia Wilde.
Director in quotes.
And we're also going to talk about Blonde, the latest from Andrew Dominic, which just dropped several days ago.
Director in all caps.
On Netflix. And I'm not sure, I'm imagining our discussion of Blonde is going to be more expansive than probably what we're going to have to say about
can I
Don't
say
Worry,
before
Darling.
we get to that it's like, that whole movie's kind of in all caps.
Blonde.
Yeah. So, but...
Don't Worry, Darling, I think wishes it was, but doesn't quite get there. Now, before we even talk...
I wish it was nothing. That's what I wish, but,
Before we even get into talking about this movie, it should be just put out on the table, like, what a torturous production and seemingly post-production this movie has had. There's been a lot been said in the press about Florence Pugh, the star, and her relationship to Olivia Wilde, who's in the movie but also directed it. I believe wrote the screenplay as well. This was an original screenplay too, I think
so.
For Don't Worry, Darling.
I think she came up with it on her own. So,
and there's just been a lot said back and forth. There's been a whole spitgate about Harry Styles maybe spitting on Chris Pine. I think it was at Cannes, or no, it was at
I think
one of the other festivals.
Venice, maybe.
Venice, I believe. And then Chris Pine's seeming disinterest in being at the press conferences for I think it's Venice, combined with Florence Pugh's outright seemingly dismissal of being involved in the press for the movie.
There was a whole part of that I have to bring this up because it's interesting to me that Doom Part 2 I think has been shooting recently. And she's going to be in that. And I can't remember if she's going to be Princess Urlan or who she's going to be. I don't know. But anyway, which would be hilarious if she's the daughter of Christopher Walken. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Let me actually look that up and see who she's going to be in that. But anyway, part of that, though, was that she was saying, she couldn't be there because she was busy shooting that. Although there was somebody else, I can't remember who now, who was like, they were out and about doing whatever they needed to do for some other promotion for whatever movie they were. And it's just like, so it just proves she just used that as an excuse to just not go, basically. Which, I mean,
and
she's going to be early.
Something was even said, too, about that a whole year ahead of Oppenheimer's release, that when the poster for that had dropped, she'd already shared that to her social media and has not done any promotion of Don't Worry, Darling. So I think, from the outside looking in, that raised a lot of people's interest in the movie, thinking, all the drama that went into this production, what could it have made? And, this was a movie that we were already interested in because it was like, okay, we like Booksmart a good amount.
Yeah.
And so, I just, on paper, I was interested in seeing, okay, what's Olivia Wilde going to do next? This is obviously a very different movie from Booksmart.
Yeah.
Booksmart seems like a really great just idea and execution of a first feature in general anyways. Obviously, it's like a teen coming-of-age movie. This is going for this more high-concept, historical mystery thriller, with horror elements, although it's not, exactly a horror movie. The movie's set in this kind of 50s suburbia landscape, and I guess we'll kind of parse the extent to which we'll spoil things as we talk about this movie.
I don't care about spoiling this movie because...
So we'll just go ahead and say that we'll probably spoil the movie in our discussion of it. But there's all this
because where it's all going is so obvious.
Yeah.
Not literally in the mechanics, but in the eventual resolution. I mean, you said that going in about it. You were like, it's probably going to be like that. And it was like, yep. It was definitely
so. There was our own little interest in the movie, combined with all this outside extra textual behind the scenes drama, and then we go to see the movie, does any of that impact your own response to the movie, and what is the movie in relation to those other things?
No, not really. I mean, I went into it... Well, let me say this. I went into it thinking it was going to be worse than it was, just by nature of what people were saying about it. Also, just looking at it, like, it just looked very predictable, very blasé, just nothing kind of movie, which is ultimately what it was. But it actually was a little better than I was expecting it to be, meaning it was like 2 stars out of 5. Yeah. But I mean, I was thinking like abhorrent, awful, horrible movie, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it was getting like kind of the buzz about it was that it was very bad, but also not all that memorable bad. But that ultimately, I think it was a little better than people gave it credit for, but also
wasn't as like memorably bad as we would have liked either.
Yeah.
So it was kind of didn't please anybody as far as what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I was kind of interested in it, and I said this kind of in my review of it early on. I was more interested in it as the concept of like, it's kind of parses and throws around all these different themes of like post-World War II, individualism, objectivism, fascism that kind of just made its way into American life and has kind of stayed there ever since, and ideas about that, and cults, and kind of like Scientology, and a lot of these different kind of ideas that I think are kind of interesting to think about, and kind of self-help, and very basic kind of like, and even like, you know, because it makes you think, oh, they're like going to the moon or something or whatever. It's never really clear what it is the Victory Project is supposed to be. I don't know. But then it very quickly just kind of becomes about everything that isn't that I wasn't interested in. Like Florence Pugh's character and her basically realizing things are not what they seem. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah. I kind of figured that out on my own. Mm-hmm. I don't know, it was just very much that kind of movie, you know, and I felt like it kind of wanted to make some statements about, like, those things I mentioned about the kind of, like, more right-wing bent this country's taken since World War II overall, and that it had before that, too. But, that, I don't know, I was more interested in that aspect of the movie, and it just didn't satiate that at all, and just kind of moved on from that. And then the rest of it, I was just kind of bored by. I didn't really think about either way. It was a whatever kind of movie.
I think, you know, I had not even seen. Wasn't the name of the Brad Pitt Angelina Jolie movie By the Sea?
By the Sea, yeah.
But like,
I want to see that.
I haven't
really
even seen that,
yeah.
but I know that was one of those like quote bad movies that have all these, you know, it's kind of looks handsomely made and it's got these stars to it, but that. Even, you know, it got
like
bad
the revolutionary
reviews.
road of its time kind of thing. It looked
That's
like,
another.
yeah,
let's throw that in the pot here too. But with specifically with By the Sea, it looks as though with a, you know, what seems to be a bad movie, it is still this window into this failing relationship. And people like to point out it with between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie that this real life drama was being
Who's
transposed.
Afraid of Virginia Woolf kind of thing,
right?
With Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor.
And so I think, you know, when you hear this behind the scenes drama, this might seem like a weird, cynical thing to say. You kind of want to see those, like, any hints of the spark of what's going on behind the scenes be reflected in the movie. And that, again, has happened in some of these examples that we just mentioned. Revolutionary Road, not as much. That's just kind of a fairly conventional drama, and it's not all that good or
and
bad.
they get along really well.
Yeah, Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio do. Yeah, although Sam Mendes and Kate Winslet have since divorced, and you know he directed that,
I forgot
and so
married,
people bring that up
right.
sometimes with that. Anyways, you know, you go to a movie like this and you know all this drama happened, and deep down, again, all we know is what we hear, and we don't, you know.
Yeah.
But like, I want to kind of see that energy or that zeal be reflected, and then it was not. Similar to what we're going to say about Blonde, and we've made it clear that we're David Lynch fans on this podcast. We've done a David Lynch movie in the past, so I don't want to make all of our discussion of both of these movies about, David Lynch.
Someone who's better than both things. Right.
A movie like this acts as though Blue Velvet's never been made. It's like, you know, the very opening of Blue Velvet communicates more in 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes than this whole movie spent the whole time doing.
3 frames.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, like, you know,
waving
the man
firefighters,
waving guy on the fire truck, and then the heart attack on the lawn, and then like the ants beneath the surface.
Well, and even the like the picket fence and the roses and
none
the
of
song
and
yeah.
Do you remember any dialogue being communicated during any of that? What is it? It's all visual. It's
Yeah.
all images. It's all the music. All of this forming these ideas. And a movie like this wants to tell you its ideas very verbally and out loud. And again, a lot of the things.
I want to see where she's going with this.
Chris Pine. Yeah. But I mean, and.
Like, what a disappointment.
The movie is so didactic and says its themes not only out loud, but screams them at you. And again, the things that actually she is saying, Wilde is saying with this movie, are things that I think we would agree with. Like you said, this like rightward fascist bend that not only has happened since World War II, but it was present before, but certainly, and this is where we'll kind of maybe let the cat out of the bag a little bit in terms of what the spoilers of the movie are, that this is all this kind of fantasy dream landscape, virtual reality landscape that really is more the whole present day of the movie is taking place in our current real world, maybe slightly in the future. I'm not really sure, probably. But that Harry Styles character plays a disillusioned, unemployed, loser who realizes that his wife is more successful and just has it all together more than him, and so he is subjecting her to this online fantasy reality
through the guise of saying, "Oh, but I want to make her happy because she works all the time."
That is, and so like she's very busy and she's like a doctor or works in a hospital or something, works all the time, and
it's like a surgeon or something.
Yeah, something like that. And so she is so busy all the time, and he's like, "No, I'm giving you this gift. Why can't you appreciate it?" Now, there's a lot of problems with this movie. And I don't think the movie would have inherently been good if Harry Styles was not in this role. Yeah. But swapping him out with somebody else would have maybe communicated this more, because a lot of the final act of what all that means, it really rests a lot on how good that performance has been. Not only the whole time, but in those final moments. And let's just say Harry Styles, he can be a talented pop artist, not the best actor in the world. Certainly Florence Pugh acts circles around him. And she's someone herself that I've been, at first I was like, I don't know about her. But then I realized Midsommar was just really not all that good, and have since seen her in Little Women and other things.
I like
you know what? Yeah. And she's really, I think, pretty good in this movie.
Yeah.
So when she's acting circles around you, you needed someone else to elevate that.
And it's like you look at Dunkirk, and it's like that was a weird trial run of like, well, you don't really have to be good in this movie.
He's fine. He's good in
that. But it's just a very like nothing role. You kind of pour into it whatever you want. Like there's not a whole lot of. He basically reacts to things more like In this, you actually have to like create a mystery, and that. I don't think the screenplay's so basic that I guess it does, but like he doesn't do that any favors either. And I mean, it was pretty much a vanity project, it seems like, for both him and Olivia Wilde, so that probably screwed the pooch.
I'm not even going to go too far into this, but there's rumors that Florence Pugh walked in on Mr. Styles and Miss Wilde engaging in oral sex, apparently. That's the rumor. And that she like flew off mad about that, and that she even, apparently some things have come out.
Like Chris Pine in the movie,
Yeah.
Maybe they laugh like, let's put that in the movie. Yeah. Like how Jack Nicholson and John Peters went out to like go see Phantom of the Opera, and they're like, let's put that in Batman. Maybe that was like a thing like that where they're like, oh, we made her mad. Let's let Chris Pine in on that.
That apparently Pugh was yelling and screaming at Wilde. I think apparently on the set, I'm directing more of this movie than you are, and so there's just a lot of things that have come. And then there was this counter thing that came out of all these people who worked on the movie signed said, oh no, that did not happen. And so there's just like all this drama about whatever happened or not.
Who even cares?
But again, like all this, like I want to see the movie about the making of Don't Worry Darling.
Yeah.
Like Don't Worry Darling itself is kind
or
of
the
like,
oral history. You get it? You see what I mean?
But I mean, to replace Harry Styles wouldn't have like fixed all the problems. But again, it relies a lot on like that desperation that character is revealed to have in the final act, and it's just not there with his performance.
Ultimately,
and so, but again, it's not just him. Like I said, the movie screams its importance at you. And again, this is a movie that I thought that this next movie I'm going to name I thought was a good amount better than this. But I even said this to you, I think around the time we saw it, was this is going to be this year's Transcendence. In terms of this, like, see, every time I get this wrong. Like, you know what's funny is I think it's because they're both from the Nolan verse. Because Wally Pfister directed Transcendence, and then Reminiscence was Jonathan Nolan.
Yes.
Anyways, this is like working in that like kind of high concept. Again, quote, movies they don't make anymore. Sci-fi thriller kind of vein.
Yeah, because we kind of got that recently, and now I'm starting to think maybe there's a reason we don't make these anymore because y'all can't make them.
Well,
you know what I mean?
As it turns out, they are still being made,
right?
Even so too, like not as regular as they. But I think the thing is, the presence of projects like these are themselves. The presence of them, I think, is the evidence of a healthy cinema in terms of, well, these get to exist and not be that great, but they at least get to try. And the more of these you try to do, naturally you're going to hit gold eventually, and you're going to have that project that's really good. Whether it's them making these, all these people I named, or Shyamalan, or
that new
Nolan,
Shyamalan movie, I'm like,
Nolan.
what the hell is any of this?
Yeah.
That trailer for that, like, what?
It's just that, these like this kind of mid-budget mystery thriller, I think.
That Jordan Peele's making now.
Yeah, Jordan Peele, he has since emerged as the king of this movie in the contemporary moment. But I think so the presence of these projects is evidence of a healthy cinema. But at the same time, the presence of maybe an unhealthy cinema is the level of attention and or pressure put on these movies. Well, they gotta be good and they gotta make money, otherwise these movies don't get made anymore. It's like, that is not exactly evidence of a healthy cinema, because that implies that these movies are becoming more and more of a dying breed and becoming fossils, and that obviously is evidence, well, if those are fossils, what is there? And it's Marvel movies, it's DC movies, Star Wars movies, all the things we complain about all the time. And so, it's one of those things is, man, I wish this was better. You know what I mean? Because the aesthetic of what it's trying to go for, and this kind of mid-budget thriller sci-fi movie, I do like the concept of, but the execution of is lacking,
Yeah. But kind of like the movie that we're going to talk about next, it's like I kind of felt like I saw the movie before I saw it. And it's kind of just like...
Well, it's like with Don't Worry, Darling, we saw the trailer and I said, it's probably going to be this, and it was that it wasn't really present day. I was even thinking with that, The Village... with Shyamalan, that like
a good movie.
And that's a good movie. Let me just stress. And
there's a lot of people out there probably like, what? Because I know that's kind of reviled. By
people
groups,
have come around on that more so.
No, they're wrong anyway if they don't like it. So whatever.
But just in the sense of like this horrific thing happening in the past. You know what? I really wish we had more movies like The Vitch.
Yeah,
and we've had things we love and not love about Eggers since then or whatever, or like even The Lighthouse. I really wish we had more historical horror movies that didn't pull the rug out,
because they feel
and
say that's the theme is right, sticks out like a sore thumb of like, it has to appeal to now. It doesn't have to do anything,
or like, just I think there's this inherent assumption people have of like, you cannot have either a horrific and or apocalyptic story that happens in the past because that just didn't happen. You know what I mean? It's just like, but the movie, who cares? You know what I mean? I mean, a movie like The Lighthouse, which I had my problems with, I really liked that it was allowed to do that and be just in the past and be a horror movie and not like have this, by the way, it's the present day. You know what I mean? Which Eggers is almost apparently detests the idea of making a movie in the present day. He's said several times, and he's much more interested in historical films or whatever. But you know what I mean? Like, it sets up this high concept idea, and just watching the trailer, I was like, probably this. And I don't even think that was that big of a, quote, get for me to guess that. I just felt like that was baked into the cake of what a lot of these movies are, or feel the pressure to be oftentimes,
Yeah. Speaking of things that may or may not have happened, Blonde.
Oh, boy.
And I want to go into this, first of all, because this has been getting an overall very negative reception.
Negative, very surprisingly negative in a lot of ways.
And we're not going to be negative on the movie overall. We have some negative things to say, but overall we like the movie. So I want to say that first of all. And we literally watched it like a couple hours ago, so we're kind of still thinking fresh about it on it. But I'll let you start with this, and we'll see where it goes, because we could go in a million different directions.
We've talked about Andrew Dominic in the past. Obviously, it was not that long ago with Killing Them Softly. We're fans of his. Obviously, we love Killing Them Softly. Really love Assassination of Jesse James
by the coward
Robert Ford. This has been a project he's been talking about for some time. I mean, and I think it went through various iterations of actresses who were involved in maybe being
Jessica Chastain, Naomi Watts. I think different folks. Michelle Williams played her in a movie some years ago that nobody really talked about.
My Weekend with Marilyn or something like that. Yeah. And I remember like, I want to see that, and then kind of disappeared. And I love Michelle Williams.
Yeah.
And she had that look, too. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
and she's literally one of the best actresses in the world. So I'm like, oh, I really wish I'll find the time to see that at some point. Oh, boy. You know, talking about this movie is a literal landmine because I hate to say that this sounds like we're puffing ourselves up. But, you know, if you have a semi-nuanced opinion on something, you're instantly a dying breed because, like, you either have to love or hate something nowadays. And there is no middle ground. There is no, well, yes, but.
Yeah.
You either hate it or love it. Now, there have been some critics who have really been a fan of this movie. I've seen online, like Chris Evangelista, Jacob Knight, Bill Jabiri, and so critics I really trust. But then some critics like David Ehrlich, David Sims, there was a few others too. I can't quite remember. I think Richard Brody hated it. Critics who have really like been.
He's like, dang, this is as long as my beard. I don't like it. Like, you know,
but so much so that like. I can't think of a movie in some time that has engendered as much of a sharp critical divide in something that is really artistically going for something. Now, you see this sometimes with blockbuster superhero movies, and frankly, those movies don't really count in this realm of movie. You know what I mean? In terms of something that's really going for something.
Right, you're saying usually these types of kind of art house movies are more just generally beloved by the critics.
Yes, and so it's frankly refreshing to see this sharp of a negative view on something, because it's like I said, I haven't seen this really in some time, and that indicates whether you like or don't like the movie.
I'm thinking of Ending Things kind of was like that, as far as like a movie that people were kind of,
we were,
but that wasn't as like
mid
wild as this is.
Yeah,
but this is also including a large section of the normal, average population.
This is another thing too. The movie's become a social media beehive that people have went after. The vast majority of which you can tell people have not seen the movie.
Are not
going to see the movie. This is very similar to what happened in Last Temptation of Christ in terms of people were boycotting and wanting that movie to go away, and they hadn't even seen the movie. That's
a more positive movie than this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just even thinking about the endings of the movies. Like the notes they end on are very different. But both are like, and I'm not going to be like John Lennon and compare the Beatles to Jesus. But there is something that happens with a figure like Marilyn Monroe, not unlike what happened with Elvis this year with the new Elvis movie, that these people cease to become real people. They become, I'm not going to use the term gods exactly, but they become these mythic,
cultural
iconic,
gods. I mean, that's what they are.
Archetypal figures that transcend us understanding them as real flesh and blood human beings. Now, a lot of people that have been critical of the movie have said that this movie is exploitive of Marilyn Monroe. It does not depict her as a flesh and blood human being. That the Dominic and anyone associated with the movie should be ashamed of trying to take on the example of depicting Monroe, but to look at her and her life as harshly as the movie has done. Again, this is likely going to go in a great variety of directions because we have a lot of thoughts on it and we're still awash in it. How does any of that fit into your own calculation of what this movie is and how this movie relates to the flesh and blood human who was once known as Norma Jean, a.k.a. Marilyn Monroe?
I want to start quickly somewhere random, which is Kim Kardashian wearing the
Happy Birthday, Mr. President dress recently.
Which is one of the most
I don't know if that was at the Met Gala,
distasteful, disgusting. I mean, it can only come from the Kardashians.
Yeah.
The most distasteful, disgusting, morbid events I've ever seen play out in real time in the media. That nobody really raised any eyebrows about or really thought was strange in any way. But that's also because, honestly, I'm not, and I want to go ahead and say, first of all, I'm not a Marilyn Monroe scholar.
I'm not either.
I don't know a whole lot about her life. I was looking about on my phone as throughout the movie because I already knew going in this wasn't going to be an accurate portrayal, like it didn't have to be because it's also based on a novel, which also was controversial for not being an accurate portrayal. I mean, it's the same thing like Last Temptation, like you said. It's based on a book, not the person's life,
or the holy text of the Gospels in the case of Jesus. But
but that with that, I don't know. It's just, to me, the whole Marilyn Monroe story is just ultimately an abject tragedy. And I think that our culture has a hard time reacting to that, or
just acknowledging
to that.
Yeah.
I don't really have a problem, and some people think that like belittles her memory or something. I'm not doing that. When I see what I see, and her life is an abject tragedy, failure, sadness. I mean, and it only implicates Hollywood, and you know, I mean, obviously people have control over their own actions, but I don't look at her life and see revulsion for her whatsoever. I see revulsion for the system that created a person that thought that that was their only avenue in life.
And the modes of masculinity that she found herself at the Prisoner 2.
Right. And, because I don't know. I mean, I could see where people think that the movie sees her as simply an object or a piece of meat, as it says a bunch of times in the movie, but literally all the men in the movie suck, except for Arthur Miller.
And even he, and I think this matches up mostly with the historical record, is someone who was confused about his relationship to her, and
he wanted her to be a person that he knew in real life.
I think he also struggled a bit with her own fame, and I think, you know, again, I'm not trying to make it all about Arthur Miller, but like he struggled with like her personhood and selfhood in relation to him, and whether or not she was really his husband or his wife. And ultimately, it doesn't even really show the final dissolution of that. It kind of jumps ahead past that, you know.
Yeah, because I was kind of on my phone for like a little bit, looking about some stuff, and then because I try not to do that much anyway whenever I watch a movie, but I was just kind of, and then I was like, wait, when did that ever happen? Did I miss that? Or
there was an abrupt cut, really, to 1962, as it says in the movie, from the dissolution of that to the last year of her life.
And yeah, so like, because I think they divorced in 61.
Yeah.
I also did actually really like and thought it was an interesting portrayal of Joe DiMaggio as somebody who, like, ultimately is a more conservative-minded person of wanting to just her to be his wife and wanting to love her, but her kept doing that. But then his reactions to that are very predictable and typical. And like I said, I'm sure the DiMaggio estate's mad, the Kennedy estate's mad, everybody's mad.
I want to talk about Kennedy stuff a little later,
but it's like, it doesn't matter because this is ultimately still a reflection of this time period. It doesn't mean anything to that, you know, I don't know. But we're, of course, of the belief that movies can literally do whatever they want. Art. They have creative license, and ultimately it's on you to go figure out if that's true or not. Mm-hmm. And if you're not going to do that, then you're just an idiot, frankly. I don't really have any sympathy for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're like, oh, I don't like what this says, it's like, well, okay. And as fact-based people, too, we're not acting like, oh, well, this is, you know, just believe whatever. But it's like, no, because the facts are the facts. Go look those up. But if this is trying to make a certain artistic statement, you can either agree with that or not, but you shouldn't really be getting mad about that.
Right.
Now, I get it from the point of view of the people's families, if that's the case. But all that has to happen is that the artist comes out and says, yes, that's correct, that isn't really an accurate depiction, but it's what I thought that it should be, you know, whatever. But Andrew Dominic, that's another kind of problem with it, is that he's been, like, very harsh and vocal about being, I'm going to do what I want. Like,
I mean, I don't know how old he is exactly. He has to be in his 40s or 50s. Some of the things he said about this movie are almost outright juvenile sounding in terms of, like, it's gonna, you know, he's been advocating for so long, this is gonna be NC-17, which, by the way, did this movie, do you warrant an NC-17 rating?
I think so, personally.
I mean, okay, so
maybe it was a little less than it had to be.
We can talk a little bit about the violence or sexuality of this movie. I think was not as bad as people are trying to make it out to be. I think what is striking is how it makes you feel.
Yeah.
And that alone is, like, probably what got it the NC-17, that it's not the least bit titillating or sensual in a way that appeals to you as an audience member. It's instead something that repulses you and something that makes you feel vile or violated by virtue of being alongside Monroe for the duration of the movie. But I'd honestly think that a lot of this has to do with the fact that there were sections of the movie that involved the female body that we're not used to seeing in a movie, And I do not think it would be the same in many ways if it was a male body that was some of the things we're happening with, that there is an inherent sexism, I think, to why this movie would, quote, get an NC-17. I think ultimately it is how it makes you feel, because I think if you go down and if you literally went frame by frame of what happens in the movie, as far compared to some other movies, you would go, well, that's not all that bad compared to this. But it is just like rubbing your face in the moments of it that is what garners that designation more so also, to me than actually literally what's happening.
Well, and to me, sometimes R and NC-17 is about maturity level of thought.
Yeah.
And this is even above, like, I think a R rating would be.
Yes,
so for me, I look at it as that way, not so much the explicitness. But also, you know, and we said this too, ultimately and I'm going to talk about some of the positive things I really liked about the movie at the end, because I want to leave us on a positive note about it, but ultimately we felt that it was like, yeah, okay, yeah. Because for me, I've been saying this for months, because I know that it's been building up to this anyway, about this whole thing about, Marilyn Monroe. Because a lot of it is about, other than the sexuality of the movie, and we can talk about this in a bit too, about how like people are, for some reason, so scared of sexuality in movies now, which is strange for a culture that is so outwardly pornographic about everything. I just find it very strange that the same culture that would, like, you know, praise Megan Thee Stallion or Cardi B to get on TV and do WAP on an award show, that they would then have a problem with sex in movies, I find to be a total, like, disconnect that I find so interesting.
Let me just play devil's advocate for 2 seconds before I discredit this devil's advocate argument. A lot of people would say that is a version of women taking control of their own bodies for themselves versus watching the exploitation of, you know, women on screen. That's literally what Marilyn Monroe would have said about her own depictions in the 50s and in the 60s, of this idea, women are taking control of their sexuality more on screen. That's what they were saying back then about that. And, you know, things like this are just showing you the dark side of, inevitably, I'm sorry to say, what's probably going on.
Who's making money on that, though?
The
Grammys.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. And so that I find that
they wouldn't allow them to do that.
I find that to be a very
if they didn't make money on it. You know,
limp-wristed argument. Right. I'm just saying, but that's what people would say. To
I get that to a certain extent, but I don't know. It just that's the reality of the story, though. To me, I mean, like I keep saying, I mean, whether these things happen or not, it doesn't really matter to me, frankly, because that's what the reality is. And even if it's not always about her, it's about Hollywood in this larger sense. But so none of this was shocking to me to see. I mean, the stuff in the movie was shocking, certainly some of it. But the conclusions, it wasn't a revelation. No, the conclusions it comes to, we were talking a lot about. It was a lot like Mulholland Drive. I felt like the whole time. I was like, yeah, this is basically that.
For Our Walk With Me.
For Our Walk With Me. And that to me, I walked away and said, oh, that's it, okay, and kind of moved on. For other people, it seems like they're just now reckoning with these facts, which I find. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, look at me, I've known this forever. I'm genuinely saddened for those people that, wow, your worldview is that narrow that you're not getting to that already.
And I'll go into some things I think about the movie, is that I think all that speaks to the fact that anybody would be surprised about any of this is, again, you know, we're not exactly scholars of Marilyn Monroe, but we are scholars, I would say, of American culture and Americans' popular culture and the history of cinema. You know, ever since she died in 1962, her image and her face have been it has ceased to, from the moment she died and even before she died, she ceased to become a real person and has become this object of beauty. Not unlike, Audrey.
Bo's bathroom.
Bo's Bodacious Family Entertainment bathroom. Go check it out.
Lenore,
we mentioned
North
it on
Carolina,
the past.
286, whatever.
You see this... let's go here. Well, let's just talk about this because I have some things that Elvis connect to this. If you go in there and you see this kind of kitschy stuff all over all the time, you go to Myrtle Beach or Gatlinburg, you see a lot of versions of this, of like these 50s icons. Always inexplicably, Humphrey Bogart is attached to this. He's more of a 40s icon, very clearly. He was alive in the 50s, but of course died then.
Yeah.
But the big three, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean. I guess James Dean's due for something soon. I don't know, since we've got.
Well, they made that James Franco movie some years ago,
20 years ago
but,
now.
yeah.
But so I think it's very interesting that Elvis and Monroe got films that came out the same year, these big biopics. And Elvis has been celebrated and really beloved. And
it's a far tamer movie, just
well, obviously that's true.
Especially in what it says about him too, and it's a more typical biopic. And
I think that is obviously, like you said, a more conventional biopic. So much so that one of my biggest criticisms of that movie, though I quite like it, is that it plays it a little too safe sometimes. Mm-hmm. This is the exact opposite in terms of depicting Marilyn Monroe's life, warts and all. So much so that it ceases to become anything that's trying to go for realism. I thought most of the strongest moments or aspects of the movie was when it just went full tail into surrealist territory.
Yeah.
Which I'm not surprised happened, but I was a little, at first, like, okay. And
yeah,
again, I think most of the best moments of the movie went into that. But again, Elvis and Monroe, we want to imagine them as these nice, smiling 50s people. They had fun. Well, they died in these tragic ways, but oh well, like, look how beautiful they are, and their art still lives with us all these years later. And again, it's crazy, and it shows that our culture's inability to really grow up and reckon with these icons is that a lot of people still cannot accept that Elvis died fat and bloated, and Marilyn Monroe died addicted to drugs and unhappy.
And
we don't want to grapple with that. Especially with Monroe, a lot of people want to jump to the conspiracy theories that, she had an affair with President John F. Kennedy, and she was killed because of that, when the reality that she was used and abused by men her whole life and inevitably led her down a corridor of unhappiness and depression that ultimately took her own life. People have a really difficulty dealing with that.
Yeah.
And again, mentioning JFK earlier, he's another person, especially it's a lot of these mid-century boomer fascination icons, a lot of them 50s and 60s era people, that he also has ceased to become a real person. And JFK
he barely had any time.
JFK, he was a president, he was a husband, he was a father, he was an adulterer, he was a war hero, he was a brother, he was a son, and all these various relationships that he's had with all these people have become these abstractions, so much so that anytime you go see a movie that's about, quote, JFK or Elvis or Marilyn Monroe, of course you're not seeing any sort of a definite version of who these people are, in the same way you never see that with a biopic, actually. And this is maybe what we should really be paying attention to here, is that ultimately there are all these artistic abstractions of whatever the artist in question is taking away from them. So to say this is the, quote, definitive Marilyn Monroe biopic is just as faulty as saying Raging Bull is the definitive Jake LaMotta biopic, in the sense of that is a person's abstraction. Now, I think if you look at just picking on those two people, Marilyn Monroe and Jake LaMotta, what I know of those people to be and what those Blonde and Raging Bull represents of them, to me, might not be, quote, factually accurate 100% of the time, but get to the essence of who those people were in startling, depraved, graphic ways, both of those examples. And again, I saw even some Twitter threads that were like, instead of watching Blonde, which is a horrific depiction of Marilyn Monroe, look at this Twitter thread of all these great things about Marilyn Monroe's life, and like, she loved animals, and she loved to read, and she loved all these things, and it's like, that's all 100% true, I have no question about that, but ultimately, it's like, grow up, be a man, be a woman. Who are these people? What do they represent to us? What did our culture do to them?
Yeah.
Let's just be adults in the room here for a second. You know what I mean? Like, and to act like
that's all I'm
bad
saying
things
about the
didn't
whole
happen.
thing,
Like, act like, they had good aspects too. It's like, most of these movies we're talking about are in any way necessarily, well, Raging Bull is, but defaming the character of the person in question. They are saying, look how they were used and abused by these other people. That doesn't mean that they didn't have good, happy moments in their life. I think Blonde, in very sparse moments, shows us that, especially with the Arthur Miller little section.
Mm-hmm.
But
her desire to have a child,
our inability to grapple with reality. I don't know what else to say. Is just like I think a very troubling aspect of all this.
That's all I'm saying about the whole thing is like it doesn't matter. You don't have to like the movie.
Yeah.
All you have to do is admit this is what reality. No, and I don't even mean reality in the sense of the actual events of the movie, but the emotional and the conceptual reality of Marilyn Monroe is that her life was a tragedy.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with Princess Diana. It's the exact same thing, and people have trouble with that too.
And I mentioned that this seems like a loose thematic trilogy. Obviously, Pablo Larraín directed, as we've talked about in the past, Jackie and Spencer, the newer
now, and it
Diana
should be
movie.
said that both Jackie Kennedy Onassis, you mean Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and Princess Diana got to live on, and especially Jackie Kennedy, but that Diana got to live on pat and break out of her life to kind of lead her own life the way she wanted it to be, although it was eventually cut short by the thing that she wanted to get away from, which is ultimately the whole tragedy of that, and that Marilyn never got to do that. But yeah, it's just, we just as a culture have a trouble with that because and it's kind of like what we said last week about the political correctness thing, which we always chafe at when people, especially around where we live, talk about political correctness. But what also becomes a problem with that is just a fear of facing the realities of life, where these things happen. That doesn't mean they are good things, but these things need to be depicted to show that this is what reality is, because that's what art is ultimately supposed to do, is to depict reality. I'm sure there's people that are laughing at this right now because they're like, but yet Blonde doesn't depict reality, it does these other things. And like I said, it goes beyond sometimes factual reality to encompass an emotional or thematic or conceptual reality. And that doesn't, all the details aren't really that important when it's about what is this person's life really.
One of the first movies that taught me this was Raging Bull. I remember watching Raging Bull and a Taxi Driver in a similar way. I think I talked about this some weeks ago. For the first time watching those movies, and I watched them pretty close to each other. I don't remember exactly the order. I think maybe Raging Bull first. I can't remember. But that was one of some of the first two movies that I watched that I was conscious that I was in the emotional headspace and point of view of a character. And that was not necessarily what, quote, reality was, okay? That I was in the mindset of being who Jake LaMotta's head so much that I, when I first saw the movie, had mistakenly convinced myself that his brother had cheated on his wife.
Right.
You see the movie again and again, and again, this is maybe just me the first time, but I realized, oh no, that is just, the movie made me think that because I was in his point of view, right? And so Jake LaMotta again and Marilyn Monroe were very different people. Don't get me wrong, but
she didn't visit the Dade County stockade.
No, thank God for that. Life would have been even worse.
But because that speaks just as ill of the Dade County stockade as it does him.
But like again, I think that all of this speaks to the not only like illiteracy of people with art nowadays, but the whole idea that like again art, as you just said earlier, depicts emotional reality, not factual reality. Okay, if you want factual reality, go read a newspaper article or go read a nonfiction book. I love both of those things. I'm not trying to defame them, but when you're walking into a movie, okay, you can't be having a checklist of this happened or this didn't happen, this didn't happen. Okay, I have a very complicated relationship with John Fitzgerald Kennedy in terms of my own understandings and conceptions of him, and it's something that's always evolving over time. Okay, so when I hear that he like sexually assaults her in the movie, and that's what the movie indeed depicts, that's all like I have to, as someone who's a fan of art, grapple with the idea that of all of the negative qualities of JFK, at least specifically with Marilyn Monroe, there was no exact evidence that he sexually assaulted her, that was a consensual relationship, right? Yeah. But again, like, as someone, I don't even know, I wouldn't say I'm a fan of JFK, but as someone who's like always going to be a student of and thinking about him in various ways, and I don't know if protective is the word, but like someone you're like, I'm going to be paying attention to how he's depicted in things, because that's just an inherently important value to me. Like, that is in fitting with the whole thesis of what the movie is, so much so that I'm like, big deal, so what? That's what the movie decided was the pattern of behavior that men had treated her with her whole life, and then towards the end, that's where it ended. And I think a lot of the best moments of the movie to me were the final act, really that last little bit, as the movie got more and more surreal and dreamlike, that it puts you in that headspace of where am I? I don't know where I am, and that that drug abuse aspect of that whole third act was, I think, very in keeping with what her reality indeed was in the final moments of her life. So, again, I'm not going to art to tell me who Marilyn Monroe is. If I want somebody to tell me who Marilyn Monroe is, I'll either A, go to the Wikipedia page, or B, read books about who Marilyn Monroe are. I'm not expecting Andrew Dominic, who played the song Heroin while people were taking heroin in a movie in the past, and I kind of respect the brazenness of that, as we talked about Kill Them Softly. But I'm just I'm willing to, you say it all the time, buy the ticket, take the ride. I'm not expecting this movie to be the definitive aspect of Marilyn Monroe, because guess what? We never will have that. Again, I would say ever since she died, even when she was alive, she was already an abstraction and not a real person. This movie, in many ways, is about her as an abstraction, and the extent to which she decides when the mask of Marilyn comes on and when the reality of Norma Jean is revealed.
And I think what the movie speaks to also is, and what I'll talk a little bit about the things I really loved about the movie, that in the beginning it's almost like she never was a real person, almost, and that is part of where I could see where people were saying, oh, it's taken away from her, that or whatever, but that's what Hollywood does to these people, is makes them not real,
specifically starlets, and even more specifically starlets, female starlets, female actresses.
But that my favorite whole aspect of the movie was the father theme of the whole movie, because if you want to think of a sadder, more depressing way to open a movie, I can't think of one than I Have You a Birthday Present when she's a kid. It's a picture of your father. Yeah. That's your birthday present you get as a child, is, oh, this is what your father looks like. Picture of a man who's not there. Yeah. And then that informs the rest of the movie, is her always chasing that. And because I really love the opening of the movie where they're driving out, there's some fire up in Hollywood, and they're trying to go to wherever he's supposed to live. And literally that's basically saying she is in hell. Hollywood is hell. And that's what this is. And I felt like that was the movie's best.
He's the ghost that haunts the whole movie, but you never see him.
And and then even, I won't even spoil this, but even some of the revelations at the end about her father and involving other characters were wow, okay. But where all of that, I felt fit the movie of saying that that's what happens to people like this, is no matter how they're, because I even looked it up, supposedly her childhood was actually a pretty good one, even despite her mother and her mother did have these mental health issues or whatever. But even despite that, she had a pretty good life, but didn't ever really have a father figure in her life. And so I think that Dominic's kind of explosion of that as a big theme in the movie speaks to not only the depravity of Hollywood to kind of say, we'll be your father for you, and make these decisions that are both supposedly paternal and just outwardly pedophilic and perverse. But I just found that to be an incredibly interesting aspect to the movie that I don't think a lot of people are going to come away from thinking about, but I felt like was the point of the whole movie. And so in that way, I feel like that speaks to another aspect of these people are never really themselves, because they did that whole thing in Elvis too, where it kind of celebrated him and itself about the comeback special of I'm going to be who I want to be. And another problem I had with that movie that I don't as much with this one was that with Elvis, it wanted to put all the blame on Colonel Parker. He was the one who made all the decisions and made Elvis' life a hell.
So much so that it robbed Elvis of any agency.
Right.
In that movie,
not only robbed him of agency, but also of responsibility for his own actions.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
And so it's not only that, he could make decisions, but that he made bad decisions, and that bad decisions led to the end of his life. I mean, it's ultimately what it was. Not that these other factors didn't play into that, as they clearly did, but especially with Monroe, I see that she obviously did make these decisions. Because I found that to be somewhat of an interesting aspect, was that when DiMaggio gets angry about, who by the way is credited as ex-athlete,
played by Bobby Cannavale in the movie.
Thanks, hilarious. One of the only funny things about the movie to me. But that he's angry about these pictures of her nude and stuff, and and he's like real angry, and he's like, why are you doing this? And she's like, but I have to work, and just this total tragedy of that statement. That's like, that's the only thing that she can do in her life, that she thinks this is the only opportunity open to me, is to be debased in this way, is the statement of the whole movie, that I think is a very basic and easy to stomach statement for me, because I understand that about Hollywood, that that's what Hollywood is, and that's what entertainment is. It's a disgusting, depraved place.
And I'm not, even more so, frankly, years ago than it is now. Not to say that it's robbed of, it doesn't have any sins like that now, but I think especially at that era, that it was worse.
And I think, and ultimately, because like you were saying, older folks or boomers are going to have a problem with this, because, and I don't use boomer in a pejorative. I don't.
I'm not either when I said that.
But literally, they are baby boomers. That's what I'm calling them.
Let me just clarify earlier. I didn't mean it in a pejorative.
No, and by the way, people who say boomer don't even realize.
Usually, they're talking about Gen X.
Well, they're also not even. They don't even realize why boomers are called that anyway. So they're all total idiots. So screw them. Because I'm going to talk bad about both groups of people here anyway. But boomers are going to have a problem with it, because they're like, I don't want to accept that my childhood was a lie, and that the people I looked up to was all a fallacy and a lie, and that the 50s were a terrible, horrible, very bad day. But that also, then you have younger people who are like, well, I'm not going to accept this kind of reality of the sexual reality and the sexual violence, and that they're just like, no, those things don't happen. I can't see that.
Wait a minute, I've got her on a T-shirt.
Right.
I don't want that T-shirt to feel violated. And it's like, we didn't even know who it was anyways. I love teenagers. I walk with them every day. Okay, this is slightly disconnected, but it goes to it. As a while back, I had a kid that had a Biscott hoodie on. It had some of his art on there. And I said, "Oh, are you a fan of his work?" And he said, "Huh? What?" And he didn't even know at all who the person was or what the art was. He thought it, quote, looked cool. Same thing you see a lot of teenagers like wearing Nirvana shirts, and I know you ain't listening to all that music and all that. And I'm not even trying to be you know all this, but like a lot of people are content to walk around with images that in many ways are more loaded than they're willing to unpack what those loaded images are.
And there's people that see that and realize what that represents and want to interrogate that, and then they're like, I don't know. And it's like, I can't think of a dumber reaction than that, folks. Like, that you're just walking around with something you have no clue what it is.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I have no clue. I'm a total ignorant idiot, is what that says when you say that.
Yeah.
So I can accept that a little more with teenagers, but it looks like we have that problem with older people too. So there you go.
Yeah.
But
I'll talk about some of my criticisms of the movie too, because they're there, and you mentioned it earlier. I mean, again, to go back to the David Lynch well, to see, we've done a podcast on Fire Walk with Me, so we've already talked about that. Go look that up. Fire Walk with Me and Mulholland Drive already were the Marilyn Monroe stories, to the extent that you see Blonde, and you're like, well, okay, you did the, quote, formal version of it, but you already got beaten to the punch with these things. And obviously, Lynch is with Blue Velvet and with Twin Peaks and with Mulholland Drive and other things, has already interrogated a lot of essentially American pop cultural icons. So much so that, I mean, again, he already did a version of this movie with Mulholland Drive and Fire Walk with Me, that to see this, and again, it's similar with Elvis, like, these people's lives, like, whether it be, like, the starlet used and abused by Hollywood who died too young, or the, like, once young, vital musician who was, got addicted to drugs and faded and never got to really be himself. These are literally the cliches that so many stories have worked with ever since then. So to see movies go back to the well to literally formally depict these things sometimes feels like, again, it's, quote, beaten to the punch. And so I do think there is an aspect of this movie that tries to work in some of the same territory as the David Lynch specifically, and it's not, I like Andrew Dominik. He's not David Lynch in terms of that quality filmmaker, even though he's good. But and so it does feel like, okay, and like you said, I was like, oh, I've already seen this movie. I already knew where all this was going. There are some literal visual surprises, though, and moments that I'm like, oh, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. And I wonder, too, I think Dominik did have a genuine interest in trying to depict her life, but I wonder, too, if he looked at this from an aesthetic visual level, okay, I'm working within the realm of cliche so intently that let me be as visually imaginative within all that as much as possible, you know, and to like flex my aesthetic muscles in the midst of doing something so quote cliche, you know.
Part of that too, and I like this about the movie but don't like it, I felt like I really loved the opening to the point where I was like, that could just be its own short film almost. Now you're not going to get the full effect of that if you don't have the whole movie, of course, right. But that it felt like the movie just kind of got lost in itself after a while, and things just kind of happened disjointedly, and I was just kind of like,
I never liked playing the card like this movie could have been shorter.
Yeah.
But I don't want to exactly say that, but like it does feel like it circles. It's got a red marker and it's circling around the same thing over and over again. Sometimes you're like, okay, I get it. Okay, I get it. And again, we've complained a little bit about Andrew Dominic's subtlety or lack thereof, even in Killing Them Softly, a movie we like better than this too. So I mean, this is something that is a deeper problem in some ways with him.
And so that was my main problem with the movie, is it felt just like it kind of went on and on and on, and like you said, there was a lot of visual imagination, but yeah, it just felt kind of like it was like, okay, I get it. Like I would actually liked it to have been a little more. It's weird because I felt like the movie needed to be a little more conventional and yet didn't go far enough.
Yeah, it's
like I don't really know which one I want more, for it to be a little more normal or to have went even more extreme but have been shorter. I don't know.
What do we think about Anna de Armas? We haven't really hardly said anything about her.
I mean, I think she's great in the movie. I don't really have any complaints about her. I mean, I really like her and everything anyway. Mm-hmm. And she gives a great performance, and she's asked to do a lot of things that I think I'm pleased to see that she has defended herself in the movie as much as she has, like, just kind of shrugged and said, the hell with y'all. We put a lot of effort into this, and whether it works or not, like, don't just be babies about it. It's essentially kind of what I feel like she was saying.
In a veiled way.
And saying that she felt that, first of all, that these things aren't that shocking to see visually and that shouldn't have gotten an NC-17. She felt that there was things she's seen that are worse than that. But yeah, I've really respected her whole, like I said, media reaction, I felt has been, and also just her in the movie, I think is really pretty good.
Yeah. I will say now, again, I think Andrew Dominic absolutely, like any director, should have, he shouldn't, like any director, should be able to make the things he wants to make. So remember that before I'm about to say what I'm about to say. I will say, I do think, like, we should see at least one movie at some point, or multiple movies, that tell Marilyn Monroe's story from a woman's point of view. Mm-hmm. Because obviously this book is from a female writer, Joyce Carol Oates, and has been controversial even in its own right before this movie even came about. So that's already been a conversation. And so again, I think this movie has every right to exist. And again, as I said earlier, people, can have justified complaints about it, and we certainly have some ourselves. But to be, frankly, immature about not grappling with who she was and what her career and life meant is, I think, unfortunate. However, I do think at some point it would be good to get a female director's point of view on this whole story and this whole life, just to get of it some variety of it. Because, again, we've already established this is not the definitive Marilyn Monroe biopic any more than the Elvis movie was, quote, a definitive Elvis biopic. Because, again, there's things about him I know that, again, rob him of his agency in that movie and whatnot. So, again, I don't know what another angle on this could be, but certainly at some point I would like to see a female director take this on just for variety's sake. Again, I'm not taking away from Andrew Dominic's right to make it, but I'm just saying I think that would be warranted at some point to get that.
I agree with that. I mean, well, and also, and that's another thing about the movie that frustrates me, is people's reactions to it about how they're like wanting to laugh about it.
Yeah. And this is the default setting for a lot of audiences nowadays. Yeah. We saw some trailers recently, and we saw "Don't Worry, Darling." We saw the trailer for, I think, Tar.
Yes.
The new Todd Field movie with Cate Blanchett, and then also was it the
Babylon?
That was the one too people laughed at, I think. Yeah, and neither one of those trailers looked especially funny.
Well, Babylon had some fun.
That did
theoretically
have,
fun.
That did have comedic beats in the trailer, but
had that one
but the
part
people,
where the woman screamed. That's my new favorite part in any trailer.
But
ever,
but the thing people laughed at was not.
Well, Tar is not funny. There was nothing funny about that trailer.
It kind of makes us laugh just in terms of the intensity, and B, like, what is this? And but we don't think the project is a quote joke. You know what I mean?
But let me say that. All that to say, as people who laugh about a lot of things, I didn't really laugh at any point during Blonde.
No, not one bit.
So that's what frustrates me is like I saw that, and somebody we love a lot, Hunter Harris, wrote a little thing talking about the font at the beginning of the movie. There's 3 fonts on the title, and it's like that's it.
Who cares?
That's all you have to say about this whole movie is that the font was weird and that annoys you. I say this about somebody I really like. I really like Hunter Harris a lot, but that just goes to... And
everybody's got to find their take or their angle.
What the problem is with this whole movie is nobody is willing to take this seriously. Nobody at all. They're just like, nope, I don't want to engage with this. I'm going to laugh at it. Goodbye. I can't think of anything more annoying than that. So, because no matter what you think about this movie, it is a dead serious depiction of her life and what her life ultimately was. And it's like, wow, great, you're laughing at that. Good for you.
I think again,
I hope you can sleep at night doing that.
I think again, this speaks to a little bit, not totally, the idea that we have so few movies that actually go for it and are quote shocking anymore. That when something is above average, and again, I'd say this is a little bit above average, but like raises the bar, that people are just unwilling or unable to, in any meaningful way, try to connect to it or try to make sense of it. Instead, it's just it's exploitive. Well, guess what? Her life was exploitive. So what are we trying to say here? Like, I mean, I don't know what else there is to say.
And it's not a goofy movie either.
No,
it's not fun. I mean, because like some people probably think that about it, but I don't know. There were certain moments I was like, actually, like, oh, this is kind of moving, or this is really sad, or this is like there was never any humor to me. I don't know. Yeah. It just wasn't funny. So,
and did there need to be?
No,
I know.
That's what I'm saying, and it's like. People would see it. People probably wanting to laugh at it in a sense of, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm like, really? Because I don't really think so.
Yeah.
Because like I said, my problems with the movie are not anything about it being... It's like almost too average.
Or, again, standing in the shadows of other greater works. I think that have all... And again, I think that's a part of inherently, as I said a little bit ago, making a movie about this person... and their life is that it was the cliche in 1962. Okay, people have been saying versions of these things for 60 years now plus.
Yeah,
and so again, that's no shot at Dominic exactly. It's just like, well, okay, you want to make the Marilyn Monroe movie, draw in and trace the lines that we all know and expect, but then certainly he goes in his own direction and does some things.
He was really good with transitions in the movie. I felt like there were some transitions that were very inventive. That I was like, wow, movies can still do that.
Yeah.
And like,
I will say too, like I do like the resolution of the movie. It does not in any one bit try to put a positive spin.
No,
and doesn't. Don't you feel like no? But this
like Elvis did with Elvis. Yeah. Right. Which was great in its own way too.
Yeah.
I mean, but no, yeah, I mean that's what just I don't know how you could start a movie. I don't know how any reasonable human being could watch a movie that starts with, here's your birthday present, a picture of your father that doesn't want to know you, and laugh at any point during any of that. I have a movie that opens that seriously and is that the whole time. I'm just like, and you're not going to take this seriously, even if you don't. Even if you don't like the movie, like fine. If you don't like the depiction, there's nothing really all that comedic here. So I don't know.
I think the most quintessentially Dominic aspect of the whole thing, and this speaks to how he's like, again, his lack of subtlety as a filmmaker, but sometimes it just doesn't matter. The idea is the idea, and you just got to follow the idea. Is very early in the movie, her mother,
played by that late, what's her name, Julianne something. She was in
Boardwalk Empire,
yeah,
among many other things.
Yeah,
here or there.
Julianne Nicholson. Yeah.
She talks about that they didn't have a crib for her as a child, and so she put her in the dresser drawer and kind of closed it. Later in the movie, and again, we could grapple with this a little bit. I don't know how much more we got to say exactly about the movie, but that like this fetus that existed within Monroe as almost a pseudo character in the movie who talks to her regularly. That is not. I don't think it's kind of an absurd thing to do, but it's not really as. I think it's well done. I think it's well done, and I didn't laugh at it. I thought I took it very seriously and soberly. But
because also that ultimately represents her wanting to become a child again, or that she always is that child too.
Yeah,
and so there's a lot of random import to that idea that people are going to laugh off and just not care.
And I think that's probably the boldest thing the movie does is that relationship and that idea. Anyways, there's a part later on where she's getting a phone call and she just cannot take it, can't deal with it, and puts it in the dresser drawer.
Yeah, and
the phone keeps ringing, and then you start hearing a baby sound.
Yeah.
And again, the themes are like so on the surface and obvious, like, but again, similar to, like I said, other Dominic moments and aspects. But it's like, but that horrific thing of her trying to walk away from it and the camera still being on it, and you hear the phone ringing, and you hear the baby crying, like that's something I'm going to be thinking about for a long, long time.
And also that representing her being inextricably tied to her career, like you can't let the career languish. Like, and it's like a baby in itself.
Right. And it can never mature. It's always going to exist in this infant state. So, I would recommend this movie. Now, frankly, if violence, and especially assaultive sexual violence, if that obviously triggers you, I wouldn't maybe recommend watching this movie, and I totally understand that. But I will say this. If you're the least bit interested in trying to grapple with the legacy of Hollywood, where Monroe fits into that, and the unfortunate aspect and nature of her life as an abstraction and her being in her life knowing that her own life is an abstraction, if any of that in the least bit interests you, then I would say this movie is an important one to see. Because I think it does, again, it's not without its flaws, but again, and this is all I ask from a filmmaker, even when you fall flat, you tried and you did something, you laid it on the line, and that's certainly what Dominic did with this. In a way, even that other directors I sometimes don't really like Lars von Trier, or even as we talked about his passing, Jean-Luc Godard did in the past. Now, some people would balk and say, well, Dominic's no Godard or even von Trier or whatever. But I would say
he
he's
makes
someone
movies that are enjoyable and good, right?
I would say, though, he is someone who's willing to engage and make art that is not comfortable, and in that way, he sits right alongside both of those men. But,
I shouldn't be that facetious about them, but oh, yeah, because he makes movies that are engaging and entertaining, so, yeah. Yeah, he isn't like them, indeed.
Yeah.
I do like Trier and Godard, all right. But, yeah, or Godard.
Any other last thoughts?
I say see it. I mean, I don't know what else to say. It's an important movie. See it. Take the time to take the ride. And just do it. I don't know. Because it's a movie that, like I said, we have some reservations about, but overall, I didn't love it as much as I actually thought I was going to, but also went in going, pretty much everything that I thought about it, I knew I was going to think I thought was a little let down. That I did think all those things. It didn't challenge me as much as I would have liked. But obviously visually and the events challenged me, but like just the concepts were like, I already knew that, okay, I don't know. I guess that's a problem. Like we've been going around in circles on this too at this point, but I guess that's just a problem for everybody else is that they're just not they're not with it. They're not on the same page. They're not up to date. I don't say that to be mean. I'm just like that's clearly what it is that y'all don't know y'all don't know, I guess. I don't know.
And, I'm just honestly glad this finally is finished because this has been something that's been talked about for a long,
heard about
long
it for
time.
Years and years and years.
And I'm glad that Dominic
it's been literally 10 years since he made Killing Them Softly, so.
And this is his first movie since then. I guess he did that documentary, and then he's directed some...
I want to say the Nick Cave and Warren Ellis music was really great in it, too. We didn't mention that. I really love that. That honestly elevated the movie to a certain extent. I was like, that can elevate anything, so...
There you go. Anyway, I know it's all tough to talk about. On a lighter note, zombie apocalypse. And in a weird way, it actually is, because it's you live or you die. It's as simple as that,
Also, movies that have varying degrees of hopefulness.
So we're going to get into, again, we're workshopping this. This could change. The double feature.
That double feature.
Here's the trailer,
baby,
for 1968's Night of the Living Dead.
Welcome to a night of total terror.
Night of the living dead, the dead who live on living flesh. The dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the living dead. A bizarre adventure in fear. An experience in shock, more shattering than your strangest nightmare. Night of the living dead. A night with the dead who cannot die. A night of total terror. Night. Of the living dead.
Love that trailer for Night of the Living
Yeah.
Dead. Totally a product of its time. I don't know if exactly adventure is the first word that comes to mind with that movie. But
we were
you
talking
know.
about that. It's like, no, I don't think that's how I would at all describe this movie as an adventure. But
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
cool, whatever. So, Night of the Living Dead is a 1968 American independent horror film randomly photographed, and edited by George A. Romero, with a screenplay by John Russo and Romero, starring Dwayne Jones and Judith O'Dea primarily. We'll talk about the other folks here in a minute. The story follows 7 people who are trapped in a rural farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, which is under assault by an enlarging group of flesh-eating undead ghouls.
I mean, you could go further into the plot, but it pretty much is summation of itself. I mean, it's literally people trapped in this kind of abandoned farmhouse trying to survive.
Right. And of course it was inspired by I Am Legend, Richard Matheson's novel, which inspired a lot of zombie fiction, primarily this, but also specifically more about vampires.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess we want to talk about the cast first before we move on to some of the production aspects. Okay. So the cast, Dwayne Jones as Ben. It should be stated, first of all, that with both this movie and Dawn of the Dead, pretty much all these actors were totally unknown, and a lot of them never really worked again or worked as much. But
either kind of were unprofessional actors or actors who maybe just were trying to start careers and kind of were younger,
right.
and then they got cast in these, and then again, nothing really much
right.
came of them after that.
But Dwayne Jones says he was an unknown stage actor. His performance was described in a 1969 review as comparatively calm and resourceful. African American at the time, which was a big deal to be even presented.
One of the
that
things
way,
we had read said that he was actually kind of the first black protagonist, pretty much of a horror film, I think, or hero, which I think was obviously.
He was later also in that film Ganja and Hess, which we haven't seen, but I know that's a really big black.
Of all the people
movie.
in this movie, he's probably the one that's had the most of a career, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, basically his character is just a guy that's driving around in the midst of all this, and he's relatively capable. He kind of comes in to the house, and because Judith O'Dea's character Barbara is already there, and he basically is able to board it up. He's able to use a gun. He thinks about using how to use the gas to get out and kind of that sort of thing. Uses the radio and the TV eventually and all that stuff. So he's very capable, the most capable of the group. Has always the best ideas also, which of course obviously was a big deal. Like I said back then, to have an African American character that be that not only present but
in a position of authority in this situation,
because the kind of other main guy, Harry Cooper, I guess was his name, played by Carl Hardman. He's like always disagreeing with him. He's the group guy that's kind of leading the group that's been hiding in the basement the whole time when they get there. Always disagreeing with him, kind of in a white supremacist light way of like, oh well, I have the better ideas and we deserve these things down here that we need. And a lot of people I read in the stuff was comparing that, and we talk about themes a little later, but was comparing that to like the upstairs is the north, the downstairs is the south. I think that's a little bit far of like a, and that's the thing about this movie too is you can look in it all you want to, but I think that the societal thematic aspects are very basic in a good way. It's just kind of like, okay, this is all it has to mean.
I read that and I was a little rolling my eyes at it a little bit. And I do think too that there are racial statements made in these movies, but they're always subtle. They're not very explicit, I don't think. I mean, I think in a lot of these situations, you could have two white men or two black men. There's going to be some measuring contest of sorts in terms of I'm the man. No, I'm the man of this situation. Right. Now there is a racial subtext to that, but I don't know necessarily think it's sometimes as pronounced as other people do. But undeniably, there is at least a muted one to say the least.
So, I think he's really good in the movie, and like I said, I really want to see Ganja and Hiss, but I feel like he already is just, and has always been one of the biggest, African-American figures in horror movies, which would go on to encompass other things as well. Obviously, Candyman being a big part of that, and Get Out with Jordan Peele now making, more black horror movies, and but that was big, especially in the 60s, and that obviously has to do with the ending of the movie as well, which we'll talk about later. But Judith O'Dea is Barbara. She was 23 years old, and had worked for, it should be said, this movie was kind of produced by a group called Image 10, which was kind of part of the Hardman and Marilyn Eastman kind of production studio and company that they had produced a lot of television commercials and industrial films that Romero produced for them.
Which is another random little connection to bring to mind with Carnival of Souls, which we can talk about later too. With this,
and so she was brought on as part of that as well. But that she was essentially looking to get into Hollywood, and had worked kind of with some of these folks. But in this, I mean, she starts out, and that's one of the most interesting things about the movie that a lot of people talk about, is it starts out, it's kind of her movie. She's sort of the lead. The movie starts with her and her brother coming to see their father's grave. They had to drive a long way to get there. Randomly, the movie is set around like the time change. It's like the Sunday of the time change or whatever. It's like a very specific thing for some reason.
Yeah.
I guess it's the spring forward time change in the spring. And it's just her and her brother kind of bickering and fighting early on, and then obviously he gets attacked and killed by a zombie in the graveyard, and then she runs into the farmhouse nearby, and it pretty much becomes Dwayne Jones's movie from then on when he shows up. But that she's pretty mute and kind of, shocked and in shock the rest of the movie.
I think there's a lot of people paint this movie with a lot of progressivism with regards to race. But with regards to gender, this movie's not necessarily the most progressive thing ever. Something that I think later on we'll talk about Dawn of the Dead corrects by that point.
But I mean, I think she plays a good shocked. You know, I mean, I think all the actors in this movie are actually pretty good. I mean, some people talked about it at the time of all these kind of amateurish actors, but I think that has just aged really well, especially with the explosion of independent cinema at this time and after it, that we're more willing to accept that sort of acting now than people were then, I think, and it's just a little more authentic, even if it's not always.
Well, strange was, I think American critics could accept it better in a French or an Italian movie more so than a lot of American movies were not necessarily working with non-professional actors as broadly as some other national cinemas were.
Looking at her films, she was in this, and then that was pretty much it. I mean, she was in movies later on, some other horror movies and stuff, but this was really the only major movie she was ever in, for the most part. Once again, kind of like Carnival of Souls, which we'll talk about later. Carl Hardman, I kind of mentioned him earlier, as Harry Cooper, and Marilyn Eastman as Helen Cooper. They're both the producers kind of the movie. They're this married couple who clearly doesn't get along very well. They've got their daughter with them. It's kind of vague about how they ever got there. And then there's the teenage kind of couple that's with them too that they're not related to. But I think it's interesting. You immediately get a sense of that guy and that family's whole dynamic of just like this very hard-nosed, annoying, overbearing father. who thinks all his ideas are the best, and literally every idea he has just totally sucks, and is worthless, basically. Although he does think it is better, we should probably just stay down here anyway until things kind of get sorted out. But that is all only invalidated by his own stupidity and inability to actually pull his weight in the group.
Absolutely.
And so, obviously, I think that the most, pitched and interesting conflict in the movie is between him and Jones, that kind of difference of thought and sensibility that they're both unwilling to accept others' ideas ultimately, even though Jones is clearly no, we need to be doing this. And a lot of people mentioned it. There's that great moment where he's we need to do this, and Jones is just is this your house? The way he says it, just what are you talking about? We all need to make these decisions together or whatever.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of inherently on Cooper's part a kind of entitlement of I was here first and I've got this stuff and I think this and blah blah blah, that's very interesting, and I think all very representative of, and because it all, like you said, all of this does have a very clearly racial element, but it's also just very a basic societal element of the way people interact with each other in general, and the way that people react in a crisis. So sometimes I think people overblow those things to a certain extent, but Marilyn Eastman isn't in it a whole lot either. She's a lot more tied to, I need to be looking after my child, so that kind of limits that as well. But the only other real two people here are Keith Wayne as Tom and Judith Ridley as Judy, who are the kind of teenage group in the teenage couple in the movie. They're there. Obviously, they're more willing to go along with whatever Ben's ideas are. They, of course, also, spoiler, but, are the first to die, really, at the hands of all this because of the plan that goes wrong about them trying to get gas in the truck to get out of there. There's not a whole lot to those characters, I don't think, as much as the others. But, then the rest of the cast is just kind of random people that haven't ever really
I think one thing this can dovetail into our larger discussion of the movie that gives this movie still a lot of its power is they were introduced through the whole movie through Barbara and her brother.
Right.
That, as you said, Ben kind of takes over the movie after, they go into the house.
Kind of at the end of the first
But the
act,
movie doesn't have a really, I don't think, an involved and big emphasis on the, quote, main character of the story.
No,
Ultimately, it's kind of this ensemble piece of these people trying to stay alive, and I think it's still what gives it this whole movie a certain modernity is the sense that it doesn't go overboard trying to tell you who these people were before all this, that it just immediately throws you into the fray, and these people are vague enough to be broad avatars for how you or I would react in these scenarios.
Right.
And I think that's
you get the
that
sense of
Romero
their lives outside of it just through the situations they're put in.
Because I think Dawn of the Dead doesn't do that a whole lot, but more so even than this does, and gives its characters more of a personality.
Right.
And part of that is that that movie has an intensity about it, but there is more of this intentionally plotting narrative in comparison to this. There's a sense of urgency that even a lot of Dawn of the Dead does not necessarily have. As much by comparison. That's a difference.
And that we'll talk about that in a bit, about the differences between that, and the pacing of that movie is totally different. It's a longer movie, it's a bigger movie, but it also, its pace is totally different, and it's a lot more about competency and assurancy that these people don't have at all. And so, and this movie, by nature of that, has always been the more downbeat and far more horrifying movie, I think.
So right about a year ago, we covered Creepshow, which of course was directed by George Romero. So we touched on him in the past, and I think Creepshow was, obviously it's a horror movie, but a fairly atypical Romero horror movie in the sense of it's it's a collaboration with another big icon of the genre in Stephen King. It's an anthology piece, so there's a lot of slightly different things compared to this, this style of Romero movie. But obviously Romero is one of the big masters of the horror genre. He died not all that long ago. I think it was maybe 2017-ish. I can't quite remember. And he is one. I think when I think of like kind of big auteurs within horror, I think of him and Wes Craven as kind of the two biggest names.
He died in 2017.
Wes Craven is someone who I was thinking like he got to make more types of horror movies. I think the thing about Romero is, as strong as they are, he's mostly still associated with he made zombie movies.
Yeah,
and I think and it seemed as though some of the things we were reading, that was a designation that he might have slightly resented. Because he saw it in these, he saw it as a jumping off point for these other things he wanted to make films about. But nonetheless, George Romero is kind of an icon of the genre. And to talk about the historical context for Night of the Living Dead is a podcast in of itself, because there's so much that goes into how and where this movie comes from. But one thought I was having thinking about this was what horror movies were in 1968, kind of as a cultural object. That on the whole, they were still seen as, something that was not exactly a legitimate medium of cinema. I mean, Vincent Canby's review of this in the New York Times kind of sums up what the prevailing thought or notion of, not just zombies, but horror movies were by this point. And, if you remember what Camby said, he especially had contempt kind of, it looks non-professional.
Right.
The actors aren't all that good. It's like from somebody, made from people in Pittsburgh. I mean, it's not pitching itself as something made in New York or Los Angeles. And again, Levi, you're a little more of a horror expert than I am, but I was just thinking, like, by the late 60s, what horror movies were like, I remember those, like, Universal monster movies, or all the, like, Corman movies that had been made over the course of the 60s, that other than Psycho, and Psycho kind of is the outlier, and I feel like Psycho maybe kind of started this trend in a roundabout way that would go all the way through probably, say, The Shining.
Yeah.
From Psycho to The Shining, that horror was starting to, quote, grow up a little bit and become a little more sophisticated. Not just sophisticated, but taken more seriously by critics. How do you think Night of the Living Dead kind of fits into that evolution for you?
I'll talk also about, it's kind of, obviously you had the independent boom of the 50s and 60s, which was really informed in a lot of ways by, of course, the European art cinema. It should be noted also that in the 60s you had started to see Roman Polanski making these horror movies like Repulsion, and then later the same year as this came out, Rosemary's Baby. These movies which was made in America.
And was taken more seriously than this, because that had more of an import.
Well, and it had a literary import. It was written by Ira Levin, and so, but that... eventually these movies are all seen as more respectable. But before this, you had started to see, all these movies that, like you said, you had those like 30s and 40s, and a little bit into the 50s, the Universal monster movies. Then you had the Atomic Age monster movies, with like Tarantula and all the Beast from the Sea movies, basically all those that exist. And, of course, you'd had Psycho, we kind of talked about being in some Hitchcock movies. A lot of people compared this to The Birds, which it reminded me of, too, of this kind of existential terror that can't really be stopped, and it's in these droves and these like, epidemics and
hordes,
right. Which, like we were talking about earlier, is all kind of informed by nuclear war and the threat of that, which was still obviously a problem at this time, but had kind of eclipsed itself and moved on from the early 60s version of that. But that ultimately you had seen that this movie, I feel like, is the biggest exemplification of that, of, what happens when the society itself becomes the monster and the people tear themselves apart. And obviously that was starting to happen by about the mid-60s, but especially around the time this movie was released, you had all the riots that had happened and various things. But that ultimately, I feel like this movie kind of just came out of nowhere in its own way, too. And I believe in the zeitgeist to a certain extent, but I also just think that Romero was so much inspired by, obviously, Carnival of Souls, which was, before this, probably now the most beloved and heralded independent horror movie ever made.
It also exists in the public domain space now.
And so that it was so influential and far more expressionistic and surreal, but using these very basic ideas of the kind of hitchhiker story and urban legend. But with this, it's using kind of some of the zombie prototypes that had been before that of kind of African tradition and religious tradition, but ultimately kind of melding into all these different things into one kind of idea that I said was inspired by I Am Legend as well. So it kind of is coming up with all these different things, but I think what was so impressive about it was that, first of all, the movie was made for $100,000, something like that. Kind of shot it over, I think it was 9 months. It took a long time to get made because they were kind of doing it while they were making all these other movies for the commercial and industrial movies. But that ultimately the movie made $12 million in America and $18 million domestically, so for a combined total of $30 million.
Internationally, you said domestically.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, internationally.
Yeah.
So ultimately it made 250 times its budget. Now, of course, at the time, and we can talk about the criticism of it later, it wasn't well received by a lot of critics. But also you had seen throughout all this time, and it's important to remember that people like Romero, of course, having later made Creepshow, people like John Carpenter, were so much inspired by these EC comics of the 50s and the kind of violence and morality of those stories. Mixed with the Twilight Zone in its own way. I think all led to this as well, of these like major social statements that could be made in a horror movie, because before that it was very basic, like you're here to be entertained.
Or like don't play God, like, you know, like in Frankenstein or something like that, you know.
And Ebert wrote a really interesting review of this movie, which was more of a reaction to audience reaction.
And especially, he noted a lot in that how many kids were there.
Right, and because this was right before the rating system came into effect in '68, which would have prevented these kids from going to see this movie. But it was kind of the last big movies for that to happen. And that saying that obviously kids gravitate towards these heroes in movies and the hero success and a kind of tongue-in-cheek fun that they would have with horror movies like the William Castle films, the Corman films, and that this doesn't have any of that. There's, like you said, there's no real lead exactly. There's no real hero. And the violence is just so uncartoonish and a lot more in your face than these other movies, which Dawn of the Dead would even further up the ante on that. But all these things, I think, come together to just represent all these changes that were starting to happen with horror films and independent films that led to a movie like this being made, that ultimately kind of just barely got past what censors would have allowed a little bit later on, literally within months. And that obviously part of that was influenced when they had the re-releases. It would have been rated R, and it would have been a problem. But yeah, that I think it's just all these different elements obviously are coming together here. But what that all represents, though, like I said, is that change from these more elementary and it's like what we talked about when we talked about the Invisible Man and the Universal Monster movies, is that with the silent movies of the teens and 20s, that horror movies had started as with the westerns and other stuff, comedies, had started expressly as, this is like a peep show, this is the Nickelodeons as like a carnival exhibit, and like, this is a little game and a little show that you're going to see. And that it all starts as that, and that ultimately this represents a total maturation of the horror film as but this actually, first of all, can be pushed to these limits that people feel, that's too far, that they had never said before that, but really since the EC comics that we'd seen, and also to actually make social statements that people also kind of chafe at or accept in different ways.
I think for you to bring up the Twilight Zone's a good little thing too, because I didn't really think about that in the context of this. But yeah, I mean, the fact that Twilight Zone came along and said, no, like, horror, sci-fi can tell these important, notable stories. Another thing too that leaps to mind is in the very same year as this, for sci-fi, you had the 1-2 punch of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes. And for science fiction as a genre on film, those were obviously two big films that really proved no, sci-fi can be taken seriously. And I think for horror, it took maybe a little longer, even though, like I said, you're starting to get flashes of, like, even the reputation and success of Alfred Hitchcock growing over time.
Yeah.
And again, Psycho was a real moment, I know, in terms of like that being this kind of big, like almost literary or import event. And again,
based on the novel.
20 years after that, The Shining, which itself had a little bit of a divisive reaction, obviously, when it came out, was able to do. But again, both of those are examples, I think, of
Carrie
like,
part of that too. Not as divisive,
but with, I think with Psycho and The Shining, you have these big examples of these like big serious film directors taking on the genre.
Yeah.
Now, somebody like Hitchcock would have already been dabbled in horror here or there, or thrillers, but somebody like Kubrick, obviously, what his reputation was by 80 was already an outsized place. And then you have this movie, and where George Romero fits in is obviously somebody who this is his kind of first film, and
ultimately what his films were all judged by.
Yeah,
over
and
the years
you know,
this.
And someone who was more independently minded, and he didn't have MGM or Warner Brothers, funding this whole endeavor or project. That instead it was, his own company really taking on this film. And I think, most of the best horror movies we've gotten over the last 50 plus years have existed either on the margins or in these independent spaces, whether it be Paranormal Activity, Blair Witch Project. I mean, and there can be good studio horror movies, but a lot of the ones that have stuck with over the years have been independent. I mean, another movie to mention that was a few years after this was Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Obviously, that was kind of more independent mindset and execution.
Halloween,
and I think that too, and
Black Christmas also,
and all of these movies, like, again, they have this homemade quality that, again, even going back to like those Universal movies of the 30s or 40s, they obviously are more factory built and produced by a studio, and all of these movies feel like, even whether they succeed or fail, these independently minded, they feel like, well, they were the vision of the filmmaker who directed them, and the ones that really succeed, especially like something like this or Halloween, are very directly made by individuals and people who made decisions that it was not part of some big, larger calculus.
Yeah.
And so I think that alone is showing that horror, and again, independent film in general was getting bigger, not just with horror, but especially with horror, that independently, that was the space where a lot of the best ones were coming out of. And I think this has always been, ever since it came out, the typification of that. And to that end, again, it's, I think what's radical about this movie in some ways is this narrative, and aesthetically, it's pretty, immediate, in your face, has an urgency about it. Again, doesn't feel the need to kind of over-explain who these characters are and where they come from. It's just immediately throwing you into it. And one thing that always sticks with me, and every time I see the movie again, it's almost like catches me off guard, is how quickly the first zombie emerges in the graveyard. I mean, it's pretty quick and immediate. You don't get any real explanation for how or why he's there. And so that always is something that sticks with me when I see it, And again, to put this in a historical context, obviously in terms of the late 60s, that, I think when this movie would have came out, which was towards the end of 68, I believe, America was obviously, admittedly, in a dark place, obviously, after the various assassinations of 68. But also, the down note that this movie ends on, which is obviously of the kind of our hero getting killed, and then you have like these, still images kind of playing over sound, brings to mind, frankly, a lot of the Nixon 68 campaign ads. There was a big similarity to that. And obviously working within the commercial and industrial film space, Romero would have been keyed on into in terms of that as an aesthetic of commercials.
Yeah, that, and especially just the imagery of the dock worker hooks and of them kind of picking the bodies up and throwing them on the fire is like this very working class sensibility to it too. I'd never thought of it that way until you mentioned that. I think it's interesting, but
and I think there is a certain symbiosis or evolution as well to the fact that, obviously in the earlier part of the 60s, we had several of these like nuclear crisis films, whether it be 7 Days in May, Doctor Strangelove's the biggest one, obviously. Also, Failsafe, that, something like 7 Days in May in the early 60s kind of has that imprint of the early 60s Kennedy idealism to it.
Yeah.
As the decade progressed, you started to lose more and more of that, which is a reflection of the national mood, I think, in a lot of ways. And this is arguably among the most downbeat of those endings. I think Doctor Strangelove obviously is way up there too.
That's inherently comedic, though.
Yeah, there is an irony to it,
right.
even despite the darkness, that there is a wit to going on there. This is very in your face, the conclusion of this movie.
Yeah.
What do you think that says about Romero's point of view in terms of using the zombie film as a reflection of the culture of the time?
Well, nobody had really done that before, because like we were saying, like you're basically saying, it's like, I mean, the only other movie I can think of with an ending like this before this, other than The Birds, which is ultimately a very positive and hopeful ending to a movie, but is so quiet and disturbing that you walk away from it uneasy.
Yeah. Despite what quote happens at the end is good, but it leaves you with this unnerving quality.
But I think a lot of the ending of the movie, well, and Psycho is kind of another version of that even though that ends on a positive note overall, that's still very
disturbing.
Yeah. And this is another one where it ultimately ends on a positive note, but I think I don't think you've seen this movie, but The Body Snatcher, the Val Lewton film, I won't even talk about what the ending of that movie is exactly, but it's just so unsettling, and just, it's probably the scariest thing I've seen in an older movie, that old, certain things about that. But it was just, I'm thinking of these certain examples, but like I said, all of them still end in the monster's vanquished, this is over, whatever, But like we said, and all these things are so, it's weird to talk about this movie and these movies because we've said the same things people have been saying forever about society is the enemy. And when you talk about that so much, it kind of loses a potency after a while. But just the idea that literally society itself and the people are the enemy, either by being dead, and something created by man itself, the radiation being released, if that's what... Because in the movie it says they think it's all radiation from a moon, or, not a moon shot, but a shot to Venus, is affecting it, and the people, we don't really know. But no matter what happened, the idea that either the dead people are affecting that, or the people themselves, the human beings themselves, that's the fact, then it can't end any other way, ultimately. There can't be a positive ending to that. Other than what we'll say with Dawn of the Dead. And also Day of the Dead as well, which is kind of a different thing, and,
Yeah.
But...
I almost wonder, too, if, like, Romero realized the darkness and despair of this, like, whenever adapting it again, or doing this again, like, you can't go that dark, because then what's the point of continuing to make these? There has to be some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah,
but at this point, he very well probably thought this was the only one of these I'm going to do, and so only conceived it as a single project.
And that obviously is a reflection of civil rights in '68, of the person who they thought could, and that really lines up with King, I think, because you think about it, the person who can guide us all out of that. Is the one who's slain, ultimately, and the person who we think is competent enough to solve our problems, as people really thought that King could do in the 60s. And I mean, we even saw that with Mad Men. There's that episode, The Flood, where his assassination happens, and Roger Sterling kind of shakes his head and says, that he could really talk. I thought that would save him, or whatever, basically saying, I thought that he could really solve these issues and be kind of a figure that we could all get behind, and that was ultimately dashed, is kind of, I felt like, very much a part of this movie too, kind of unconsciously, because it was being made before that even happened. But other than that, I think the ending is just, it's one of those things where I think there's certain aspects of this movie that just speak for themselves. They don't really have to mean anything necessarily, even though they do, I think. I mean, I think one of the most, something I had never considered, one of the most interesting aspects of the movie is obviously the famous line of, "They're coming to get you, Barbara," and who is it that eventually comes to get her? Him. Dead.
Yeah, right.
And I just think that's such a powerful metaphor that literally doesn't, I don't really even know what that means, but it just, the power speaks for itself, I think, of that. And I think that's why movies like this ultimately endure is because they can mean so many things and yet mean nothing at all because it's just such an entertaining movie.
And that I think that's the platonic ideal of a genre movie in general is that you can be something that you just have light fun with, or if you want to take it more seriously, the depths are there.
Yeah,
and that very rarely actually happens, I think, but that's the ideal for what a lot of these movies can be. And to that point too, I think one of the articles we had read mentioned this, that her brother kind of joking about death is the first and last time that happens in this movie. That there's
and he's immediately killed after
it's
that.
a very intentionally humorless movie on the whole. Something that Dawn of the Dead isn't exactly the same because there's more of a sense of humor about that movie.
That's more of a definite satire.
But again, I think it's pretty clear that in 1968, Romero wasn't finding a whole lot to laugh about.
No,
and so
and I mean, because that's the thing is it's not even, and he's always had, I think, a preoccupation and interest in crowds. Because I mean, you look at, because it's very interesting. You look back at Carnival of Souls, which was such an inspiration, and I think probably one of the greatest scenes in a horror movie ever is the climax of that movie where they're all at that dance and she starts running away and all of them start running after her, and it's just dead silent soundtrack of the faces just going past the camera screaming and yelling, but you can't hear anything, and so that's something that's very basic, but I think just immediately lent itself to these types of movies is that people running or chasing each other or chasing one person. I mean, he did the same thing in the amusement park as well, which just finally got released. And we talked about that movie a while back at some point. But that seeing that happen about crowds chasing people is just one of people's biggest fears anyway. But to see that actually put to film in those ways is always interesting, I think. And so in that way, it's a very basic, I think, idea in a horror idea of the crowd against the individual or the crowd against crowds and the division within itself that has rendered this as being so immediate, even though, like I said, it's tied to those specific things of the time of crowds and riots and whatever.
I think another thing too about the zombie metaphor that obviously Romero was the first to figure out and perfect, and so many things since have aped, is for all these political significance we're attaching to the various aspects of these movies, that ultimately, the zombie itself is an apolitical creature. I mean, it's it's literally an undead person.
A force of nature.
It's a force of nature. It doesn't have any intention other than to feed, and by virtue of that, I think there's a simplicity to the metaphor that, similar to what we were saying about the whole movie, allows for all these various interpretations to sprout from, but again, are not explicitly there. But there's enough enough room for interpretation to, let people bring out what they want to of it. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why this film continues to have the power that it does.
Do you have any other thoughts? Or
no? I think that sums up.
I wanted to say
the Living Dead.
One thing about this that I think is kind of outside the movie, but I don't know if I ever told you about this. So, when I was in film school briefly, a teacher you also had there, Professor Juan Carlos Case, who's a really great professor. I loved him, and I think he's really a great guy. He's really interested in a lot of genre cinema. Obviously, I think his favorite movie ever is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he talked about, we were talking about basically mood, or how a soundtrack can affect mood in a certain way.
Yeah.
And that he used this movie as an example, a certain sequence. He used, I think first there was a scene where he used the Black Sabbath song Black Sabbath from the album Black Sabbath, of course. And use that and put over it and show this is what the mood of this gives it. And it gives it this more, obviously it's more to the movie. Then he used the song Let's Spend the Night Together by the Rolling Stones and put over that same scene. And it was just so different how weird it was. It was kind of comedic and weird about all the people trying to come in, and it fit it in this really weird and kind of very perverse way that I've never really witnessed with anything else that is on. I don't know that is relevant in any way, obviously, to the movie, but it's just something that's always stuck with me also as kind of an ancillary thing of the movie, how that kind of matches up with that and how kind of weird of an experience
well, also,
that was
too, how amorphous film is, that just something as simple as the choosing of music can affect your
right,
own
and that was what he was
scene.
ultimately telling us with that. But obviously, Black Sabbath, that felt like a Black Sabbath music video almost, you know. But then to hear like a really upbeat Rolling Stones song, that isn't even one of their earlier songs, so it's even more upbeat, I think, than their later stuff, more pop song inherently, and also that fits the era that it was released in, both those songs, and kind of showing. I feel like that's almost like its own little document on the movie, is two songs that were released in the 60s. Or well, I guess Black Sabbath album might have been 1970, but anyway, it's like both are around the same time as that. How the different extremes of that time period, I think, is just kind of interesting too. But anyway, like I said, it doesn't really have anything to do with the movie, but
sure.
Yeah.
Night of the Living Dead, available in a lot of places. You can find it on YouTube.
I want to talk about that actually before we move on, the specifics on that. So
we watched the Criterion edition,
which is a really good restoration, because I've seen some really bad versions of it. But let's see here. So the copyright status, it says it entered the public domain in the United States because the original theatrical distributor, the Walter Reed Organization, I don't know if that has anything to do with Walter Reed Hospital or not, but failed to place a copyright indication on the prints. And at the time, United States copyright law held that public dissemination required copyright notice to maintain a copyright. So I guess the movie was just so independent that they literally forgot, the theatrical distributor, to put a copyright on the movie.
Yeah.
So that somebody literally forgot, and thankfully allowed us one of the best horror movies ever to always be available to everyone all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it because it's literally one of the most seen, viewed, beloved movies ever, to the point where everyone has seen it, everybody knows it, and it's just such a part of the Halloween season as well, and just like everybody, it's on all the time. Everybody, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think what people like about that movie so much, and why it plays in that way and at festivals and stuff, is because it is both black and white, so it feels kind of old, but it's so kind of gruesome and more violent that it feels modern at the same time. So it's literally like coming at 1968 and right with New Hollywood ultimately represents also that kind of seesaw tipping point of a more basic old monster movie and like the more gruesome side of that too. So I think it's kind of a perfect movie in that way as far as that goes. But
absolutely.
Anyway.
So that's Night of the Living Dead, again, available many places. The Criterion edition looks really great, but you can find it on YouTube just as well. And now, though, you're going to hear the trailer for its sequel, which came out 10 years later, Dawn of the Dead.
In 1968, George Romero brought us Night of the Living Dead. It became the classic horror film of its time.
Not that room! Not that room!
Now, George Romero brings us the most intensely shocking motion picture experience for all times.
It gets up and kills. The people it kills get up and kill. This situation must be controlled before it's too late. They are multiplying too rapidly.
Dawn of the Dead.
Meet me on the roof at 9 o'clock. Get out.
I don't believe
We're
it.
going to
What?
get out in the chopper. We've got to survive. Somebody's got to survive.
They kill for one reason. They kill for food. They eat their victims.
Imagine, if you will, that something has gone terribly wrong.
Shoot it, man.
Now, accept the fact that there's no escaping the horrible consequences. George Romero brings back the dead. Night of the Living Dead has ended. Dawn of the Dead is here.
We must not be lulled by the concept that these are our family members or our friends. They are not. They will not respond to such emotions.
Operator dead. Post abandoned. We may never get out alive. It's everywhere. What the hell is it?
Looks like a shopping center, one of those big indoor malls.
What are they doing? Why do they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory, what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
What is it?
We've got a war.
I'm afraid. made.
We have spawned our own savagery. Soon it will consume us all. It is a horrible, hauntingly accurate vision of the mindless excesses of a society gone mad.
They must be destroyed on sight.
When there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
We are down to the line, folks. We are down to the line.
Dawn of the Dead.
Now, I was fairly familiar with Night of the Living Dead, but I've seen Dawn of the Dead a good amount more than I have Night of the Living Dead. So I called it a sequel, but kind of, sort of, not exactly.
Yeah, it's a spiritual sequel, just like Day of the Dead is a spiritual sequel, just like Land of the Dead is a spiritual sequel, just like Survival of the Dead and Diary of the Dead are spiritual
I wonder,
sequels.
I'm sure Romero's talked about this in the past. I would imagine it, for him, every new crack at the bat, so to speak, of the zombie movie was a chance to do and say something a little different than the last time. And obviously, by this point, his career was at a better place, and there was the funding in place to do something a lot bigger and more expansive than what the first film would be.
Yeah. I do want to mention quickly about that trailer, which it wouldn't be a trailer of the 70s if it weren't spoiled, if it didn't spoil everything in the movie.
Yeah. It doesn't really do it. You wouldn't really hear as many spoilers through the audio, but the visual spoils it. Yeah.
But yeah. So, Dawn of the Dead is, and by the way, I should say, Dawn of the Dead is one of my favorite horror movies, favorite movies, period. It was a big deal for me. I mean, I had seen Night of the Living Dead before this, maybe once or twice, just by nature of it being public domain. But this movie was just a really big deal for me, and I watched it a lot in the early 2010s, kind of when I was in middle school. It was just a really big deal to me, and so I didn't watch it for many years, and then I saw it again here a couple years ago, and then watching this again, and I'm glad to say it still retains its greatness, and it's one of the most beloved movies ever, along with the first one. So, but anyway, it's a 1978 zombie horror film, of course, 10 years after that, not the band 10 years after, which is make terrible music, but anyway. Written, directed, and edited, of course, by George A. Romero, and produced by Richard P. Rubenstein. I want to come back to him in a bit, because he's kind of a big producer of horror movies. But yeah, this is an American and Italian international co-production. Kind of also fostered by Claudio Argento and Dario Argento. And we can talk about kind of the significance of that later. But essentially, yes, the second film in Romero's series of zombie films. And though it contains no characters or settings from the preceding Night of the Living Dead, it shows the larger scale effects of a zombie apocalypse on society. In the film, a phenomenon of unidentified origin is called the reanimation of the dead who prey on human flesh. The actors David Remge, Ken Foree, Scott Reininger, and Galen Ross star as survivors of the outbreak who barricade themselves inside a suburban shopping mall amid mass hysteria. So, to speak briefly about the movie before we get to the actors, he said he wanted to make another one for several years, but he kind of avoided it because he didn't want to be stereotyped as a horror director, which is kind of funny because he made The Crazies and Season of the Witch in that amount of time, and then also even the amusement park, which wouldn't be produced for, or wouldn't be seen for a long time, but that ultimately was kind of a horror film in its own way, and then also Martin as well, which was made just for this. But yeah, obviously it was filmed in Monroeville Mall in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. Interestingly, the movie begins in Philadelphia, which is something I always kind of forget. But yeah, so this is also Tom Savini's first work with him. Well, no, actually, he worked on Martin before that, and then worked on this, and it's clearly a Tom Savini film.
Obviously, he's a legend in the makeup world and the effects world, as being one of the very best, and I think this movie helped elevate him.
And also, he's in the movie, of course, and we can talk about him when we get to the actors in a bit. Just interesting performance. But yeah, let's get to the actors real quick. So we already kind of talked about what the movie's about, but David Emge as Stephen Flyboy Andrews, who is kind of interesting. He's the top build, I guess. Oh yeah, because they did it in alphabetical order. Like we were kind of saying, this movie doesn't really have a main character either. I mean, actually, if there's any main character, it might be Galen Ross's friend in its own way in the movie, because it literally opens with her,
and
ends with her, and so in that own way, it might be her movie in a certain way.
Yeah,
but it's kind of all four of them kind of stand as a shared
I really quite like
quartet.
Night of the Living Dead, but what I like about the characters in Dawn of the Dead is that, again, they have a little bit more room to breathe and a little bit more personality. Right. That it's not about exactly just the immediacy of survival, that they actually get to exist for a while and kind of play off one another.
Right.
And I do like that as a difference.
Yeah. And
obviously David Ingey's character, Stephen Flyboy Andrews, he's basically the boyfriend to
Fran. He was like a traffic reporter, so he can like fly a helicopter.
So that's his big thing, is he knows how to fly a helicopter.
Because the movie opens, and we can kind of talk about, I guess, the pacing of the movie later, but the movie opens with total mass hysteria at like a news studio where they've got this kind of television anchor guy interviewing a kind of, I guess he's like a scientist or a doctor, kind of expert on what's going on, and them arguing,
like mass chaos,
and like everybody's running around, and it's kind of weird. It's kind of like the first movie in an updated sense of like it immediately starts in this in media res of just not madness and nonsense of just like nobody knows what to do or what's going on. And we kind of talked about this. One of the funniest things about that scene is there's a couple people who were so frustrated with what's going on. They're like, does anybody need a ride? And they're like, let's leave. And then even the cop who's like guarding them leaves. And it's like, where are they going to go?
Everything's the look of that cop who's like
just
kind of propped up against the wall and
takes his coat and very 1970s looking man. But and it's just like, where are y'all going to go? Like, everything's in total shambles. Like, I don't know. It's just an interesting... People trying to retain that sense of normalcy even in the midst of all that, I think is interesting. But David Ingey's character and Galen Ross's character, Stephen and Fran, are both work for the studio, and they've decided we're going to steal this helicopter and leave and go somewhere. In the midst of all that, there's also a friend of Stephen's named Roger, who's a like SWAT team guy, who Scott Reininger's character, who's like in the middle of like basically raiding this like project, this building in the projects where there's this like gang that's living there, and basically is like taking it over as like a small militia force or whatever. And there's all these zombies that are trapped in there with them too. And so there's basically this big kind of shootout and madness going on there with the different factions and the zombies, and it's just total mass chaos inside the building. That, of course, has the kind of one of the most famous moments in any horror movie ever of like the Wooly character, who's his own just total madness. It's a shame we only get him for like a few minutes. You know, it's about not a shame that we lose him though. It's about all these racial epithets and just a total crazy person basically. But he like real quickly runs down some stairs, busts down door, and just blows a zombie's head off. I mean, it's one of the most shocking. I'll
never forget when I first saw that moment. I was like, oh my god, it's like one of the craziest things I've ever seen.
Obviously, that first movie was so violent in its own way at the time, but I feel like Romero was clearly already making a statement of like, look at what we can do and get away with, and it's just so immediately in your face. I mean, it happens within the first 7 minutes of the movie, something like that. It's not very long,
and I think the most shocking thing that had been in Night of the Living Dead was obviously the girl eating
the father,
her father.
And stabbing her mother to death, and
for 1968, that even now to see that was wow, that's disturbing. But even within 10 years, as far as one of the bullet points we had here was 10 years later, what had changed, just the fact that obviously you could even depict some of the things that happens in this movie.
Yeah.
And obviously later on when people getting ripped apart and some of the gore effects for that are like, wow.
The guy who's wanting to get his blood pressure checked so bad, and it's like, your zero is what it is, 0 over 0 now. But and so anyway, like all this craziness happens. And Roger meets up with this guy named Peter, played by Ken Foree, who like is probably by far out of all these movies the biggest star to come out of this stuff. He's been in Rob Zombie movies. He's been in just like a lot of random stuff after this. Notably also an African American, so that's still a big deal for the time, and that he's continuing, and that he would continue to be in all these things. Is just a big success story. He's also in that movie Night Riders, another, which is one of the most ridiculous posters I've ever seen. A George Romero movie. I don't even know how to describe it. If you haven't ever seen the poster for Night Riders, go look it up. He was also on the Dukes of Hazzard. He was in The Wanderers, that movie that was a Richard Price adaptation. Let's see other stuff he's been in. Riptide. A lot of TV. JoJo Dancer, Your Life is Calling as Big Joke. From Beyond, that movie. That Stuart Gordon movie. Buford Bubba Brownlee. That's a name. Wow. Death Spa. Oh, I already love that. I haven't seen it. Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. I forgot he was in that. Quantum Leap, it says he was on. Matlock. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, but X-Files. He was in the Dawn of the Dead remake as the televangelist. Whatever that even means. Yeah, he was in
San Andreas pedestrian. He was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas.
Oh, really? Okay.
Voice.
But of course, he was in Halloween, the Rob Zombie version, and Devil's Rejects. We forgot to mention that.
Yeah,
that's obviously probably one of the biggest things he's been in as well. I think he's actually really good in that. Pretty funny. So yeah, he's been in a lot of stuff. Some John Henry thing. But anyway, so all these people get together and they decide we're going to leave and go somewhere. They're not really sure where. And they end up in a shopping mall, obviously, and which was kind of a big, that's one of the biggest things about this movie. It's only shot for $640,000, so it got a bigger budget. It made $66 million, obviously.
Yeah.
But still, and we talked about this a lot while watching it, just they literally got by on a wing and a prayer on that budget. I don't know how they make
the most out of that.
That's probably the most I've ever seen made out of any budget. But I think it's just by nature of being able to shoot in the mall. It's kind of all there for them anyway, and they're just kind of able to use what they need, and they probably really got down on their hands and knees and begged for a lot of stuff for that. I don't know.
They probably got away with things they shouldn't have.
Right.
Too.
Well, because I know there's that car in the movie that they get in that one scene that they're driving around. They wrecked that and turned it back in. It's like, yes, sorry, we totaled it, and just kind of shrugged. I don't know what happened there. But that all kind of leads us to Galen Ross as Fran, who's we kind of said was the main character of the movie in its own way. She obviously, and the whole movie is about people who are relatively capable of handling themselves. It's far different from Night of the Living Dead, which is about nobody can figure this out, everything sucks, and nobody knows what to do.
Because
and
at the forefront of this, obviously, Kevin Forey's Peter and Scott Reinger's Roger Trooper, as he's nicknamed in the movie.
Yeah.
They're obviously they're basically National Guardsmen.
National Guardsmen, SWAT team, something.
Yeah.
It's kind of vague about what they actually are. But,
and then at first it's like, oh man, Flyboy and Fran, we got to carry them. But they both quickly adapt and actually become capable members.
He can fly the helicopter.
Yeah.
She can, learns how to shoot. She learns how to fly eventually. Helps them out just wherever they need help. But
I do like that doesn't keep that resentment for long, that they actually do become a family of sorts to stay around and survive.
Right. And so in that way, she's far more of a heroine, a feminist and heroine of the movie than Judith O'Dea was
allowed to be,
and was even allowed to be for Night of the Living Dead. And I think she's overall the most interesting character of the movie, because she's also pregnant in the movie, and that is seen as, oh wait, we're gonna have to carry her through that too. But there's that scene early on after they all figure that out where she's like, I don't want you to treat me any different, I want a vote, what's going on, and just lays it all out. And
that's a very progressive thing to do in the 70s, is something like that.
And that they're all willing to accommodate that and say, okay, because Ken Forey's like, yeah, fair enough, okay, whatever, we'll go by that. And they're the ones who live at the end, so spoiler. But
I wonder too if a statement that Romero's trying to make is obviously that women were getting more power, rightfully so, in the 70s, but that further societal breakdown kind of destroys some of those associations we have of, well, men do this and women only do that, and that once society's breaking down, none of that stuff matters anymore. It's like, what can any one of these four people bring to the table in a pretty clear way that was not, there in the past.
To So that's what I love about this movie is that it's a far more contained group of people, but that they have way more of a personality and their characters and like actually really there. To talk briefly, I want to talk a little bit more about the plot specifically and the pacing because I think it actually has a lot more moving parts than the Night of the Living Dead did. Obviously, the movie starts in all this chaos and they are able to escape. They make it to the mall. Most of the movie, the main bulk of the movie, is them clearing the mall out from the zombies and kind of setting it up as their own kind of sanctuary or oasis in the midst of everything going on. That includes not only killing the zombies, but also having to block the entrances and all that. Of course, in the process of that, Roger gets bitten and eventually dies and becomes a zombie briefly, and they kill him. And then everything kind of settles out into this sort of malaise. But
real quick, we should just specify that there is a difference in how zombieism is in this movie. That in Dawn of the Dead, it's more clearly a communicable disease.
Right. Then the original, it was just whatever's in the air.
Yeah.
Itself, the radiation.
And when everyone dies, they can become that.
Right. And this is kind of more vague about that, but it follows more of what will later zombie movies would adopt, is that it's a disease and a virus that is affecting these people.
So your point, though, so everything settles down. Yeah. Okay, I think we got it all figured out.
Interestingly, though, I think that's the most interesting part of the movie because it's like nothing's really going on, and it's like, okay.
It's almost a Western. It sets in of sorts, and a lot of John Carpenter movies get compared to Westerns a lot, but I mean, I think there's certain ingredients of this in Romero's zombie films too, in terms of just this like waiting, the calm before the storm, and we're waiting at the saloon before the next miscreants show up.
One thing I want to mention before we jump to our favorite part of the movie for many different reasons, but that is that there's that scene where it's just them three sitting and they're eating dinner. And it's like one of the most lovably overdramatic scenes in any movie ever, where Steven's over like messing with the TV, and she's like, "Hasn't been on in 3 days. Why don't you forget it already?" Like kind of voice, and he's like, "They might come back on." Like it's like, and like that they're waiting to see if the channel, the people, because there's been all these broadcasts from like the Francis Ford Coppola with an eye patch guy who was like in The Crazies also, and the of them all arguing still, and it's funny because you can tell it's like a different group of people in this in this different kind of situation of a studio, and it's like, I wonder what happened to those original people. Did they die or what happened to them? But anyway, and like then she gets up and turns it off, and he goes and turns it back on, and she's like, "What have we done to ourselves?" And it's just like, what, you're literally arguing over the TV can be on or not? Like, it's just kind of, that's one moment I feel like it's a little heavy-handed about the movie, is it's like just underlining the theme of like, we're fat and happy now, and we're arguing over, can we get the TV on or not? And then the movie takes this whole other turn where it's like, oh, now there's bikers that want to get in on the action.
Which at points I wonder, you know, I'm of two minds about it, because deep down I really love it for one thing, so let me get that out of the way.
Yeah.
But part of it feels like Romero was like looking at the architecture of the movie and was like, we need something, we need to throw something else in here. It's like, what if we just had random bikers come in? But I think there is this, and I think why it ultimately works and is actually a great aspect of the narrative, is that there is this like how certain people respond to disaster versus how other people respond, and then ultimately,
and it's all a big game to them,
and how to the bikers that it's like, well, this just allowed them to be the version of themselves they always wanted to be.
They already live in chaos and anarchy,
and so they just see this as the next big fun chapter, as opposed to these real people, even people that are National Guardsmen or SWAT team members who obviously resent that this all had to happen and have like figured out a way to live and have kind of made peace and are settled, versus this Roman pirates
people that were already that anyway. And
I think that's why ultimately it works, is like a final counterpoint behind what is left of humanity. You have this versus this, as far as you know, comparison.
I want to talk briefly about some of the actors that play the bikers real quickly. Of course, Tom Savini is kind of their sorta leader, or one of their leaders. And then there's that other guy. I don't know the actor's name, but he's overall my favorite person in the whole movie. Rudy Ricci, I think is his name. I actually want to put the audio of this here, the scene where they're introduced and they're looking at the helicopter, and they're basically looking through binoculars about the whole setup that they've made, and a certain line reading of his that he has.
must get in through the roof.
Son of a bitch.
I got trucks blocking all the entrances. Look at that.
Yeah, trucks. No sweat.
Son of a bitch. Yeah, trucks. No sweat. they're just like, yeah, trucks. Like, it's just like that guy is just so immediately like, I love everything about this.
Yeah.
Like, and
Halloween Havoc indeed.
Right. And then of course, like later on when they're like talking, when they're first introducing, when they introduce themselves and they're like on the radio talking to him and they're like, he's like kind of talking like, hey, what's going on in there? What do you got going on? And then he just eventually like, yeah, y'all just, we don't like it when people don't share, and you just effed up real bad. Like, and then, so anyway, they very quickly come in, open everything up, and are just driving through the mall. They literally drive the motorcycles in the mall.
Yeah, that had to be something I wouldn't imagine.
Yeah,
I don't know. I have a lot of trouble imagining the people who ran the mall giving them permission to do
well, and
all
also
that.
they were all a real motorcycle gang too, I think. So they kind of just let them run riot in there and just kind of do whatever, basically under supervision of Savini and some of the other ones. I think kind of probably helping them to do whatever they needed them to do, but. That ultimately, it's just one of the biggest right turns in movie history of just like, oh yeah, bikers now, which kind of fits, and we had talked about this yet when we were watching it, that it kind of fits that like, 60s and 70s archetype of the biker movie, and that kind of melding of genres, and like I said, it kind of feels so out of nowhere, but like you said, I think kind of fits the kind of the dualism of the survival aspects of the movie of the nomads and the kind of campers of the people who are going to stay in one space, and that these people are more willing to live with the chaos, and that as a representation of kind of the barbarian archetype, I think is a very interesting and very apt and unexpected aspect and element of the movie that I don't think anybody could ever expect that it would be. But yeah, just so hilarious. Like, because the whole movie, and we can talk about this a little bit now, I guess, is that the satire of the movie, which is very obvious throughout of, and before we even get to what the movie's really about in general, but the movie's very funny. It has all these, aspects to, even early on, is a lot funnier than the original. But that ultimately opens up just they're throwing pies at zombies, they're stealing wallets out of their back pocket, they've got like...
That's always... I forgot about that, and it's just I remember the pies, but it's like... That's like, money doesn't even mean anything anymore. Why are you like going through their pockets? Like, and there is also, I think, a satirical element to like when the whole sequences of like, all right, we've got everything settled. Like, now let's enjoy the space of the mall. And that earlier, Flyboy Stevens character, it's kind of says explicitly out loud like what the themes are of like, why are these zombies going back towards the mall? And he says something along the lines of
literally one of
it was the world that they knew.
Yeah, it was a very important place in their lives or whatever. And I feel like that is so both. It's so many things. I think it's one of the most randomly important lines in any movie I've ever seen because it is both overbearing
on the nose,
on the nose, but poetic and also incredibly depraved and sad and depressing, and like just so many things of like this place was important to them. What a friggin' shopping mall was important to these people, but it's true. It's like this is where these people went.
Not only them though, like I said, like once they get the zombie part taken care of, and they're like, all right, we think we can live safely in here. They themselves engage in like, oh, we can go and get money out of the bank, and you never know. Let's save the money, and we can go and get dressed up like, and so. That in this midst of
hockey,
and and again it's like it's both like it's it's at once satirical and like obviously making fun of society, but also kind of touching. That's like they have nothing else going on, so let them be the versions of themselves they always wanted to be.
Like the bikers are.
Society and commercialism had tricked them into thinking this is what happiness is, and oh well, now you can have it, but it's because society has literally collapsed, and we're trapped in this place that people once wandered looking around window
'cause
shopping
there's
thinking,
that-
I want that, I want
There's
that.
that great shot in the movie. It's kind of in the middle of a sort of pseudo upbeat montage of them. You probably remember it, where they're walking really slowly up the stairs with all their stuff in their hands, and they literally look like zombies themselves. It's very on the nose, but it's something I didn't ever think about until I watched it this time, of the way they're walking literally looks like zombies almost. But then, like you said, you mentioned about them wanting to be the versions of themselves they always wanted to be, is that then the barbarians come in and they take some of the money and stuff, but there's the funniest moment in the whole movie, ultimately, other than the trucks moment, is those guys that are looking at those TVs and pennies, and the guy's like, what the hell you gonna watch on that thing? And he's like, I don't know, man, and literally takes a sledgehammer and just like smashes both the TVs just up awful. And it's like that literally they're like, no, we reject everything these people want, we're just here to tear
and
all
we did
the
before
hell.
we did before all this had happened, and we're gonna still do it.
And so all they care about is riding around and raising hell, and so that is another interesting aspect. But ultimately, it's like that Romero isn't saying that either are a healthy way to live your life, or and so it's interesting that then it's like, well, what is anything? And he's like, it just shrugs and says, I don't know. And that's an interesting, I think, ultimate theme of the movie, is that it's so anti-consumerist, but also isn't so libertarian as you would think it would be either, because we were kind of talking about that and the hopeful aspects of the movie too, and the way it ends, but that ultimately it early on it says, the government can't take care of us, and the government can't do
and
this
is obviously at the tail end of a decade that had wrought Vietnam and Watergate and so many things that people had been, I think
Gerald Ford.
Anger at the government in the late 70s was like at its all-time high, because it was like, again, between all these ways in which government was either lying to us or incompetent about, that people were just so fed up. And I think you see that clear societal breakdown, and it's like, well, it's really every man for himself, or every group that can constitute itself for itself. And obviously that distrust or antipathy for an authority is even stronger and more part of the text in this one than what it was even 10 years before with Night of the Living Dead.
But also at the same time, when it's saying that, government can't help us and we're all kind of fending for ourselves, at the same time, the success of the movie and the people in the movie comes from working together and using each other's strengths. But ultimately says also this kind of libertine chaos that happens with the bikers just destroys everything else anyway. And ultimately the ending of the movie, where the only people who survive, spoiler, are Peter and Fran, because obviously Roger becomes a zombie, and then Steven in the climax is bitten and becomes a zombie and comes back to where they are and kind of leads the zombies up to where they are, that they still are able to fly away and get away. And it's kind of a great final moment of the movie where he's like, how much gas do we have? And she says, not much. And he just kind of laughs and shrugs and says, all right, like, whatever, we'll see what happens. And that obviously with the name of the movie, Dawn, indicate, literally, it's like the I'm the Batman moment of in the Dark Knight of it's darkest just before the night is darkest just before the dawn, of that whole aspect of, and a dawn is coming, but there's a hopefulness to the movie that I think also is in Day of the Dead randomly, which spoiler we'll talk about later. But because that's one of the most like depressing movies ever made, But ultimately, it's kind of a similar thing with that too. Of like, you keep trying, and eventually you'll keep on surviving, and you'll get through it, and something will work.
And I think one of the most touching moments of the movie to me, and this is a very strange thing to say, but follow me on this. One of the most optimistic moments of the movie is the very sweet or touching scene where. The two of them are like sitting down for dinner, and they're all dressed up, and then Ken Foree had like made them dinner, and it's like and then he leaves, and it's in that moment that like he proposes to her, and she says no. I think it's actually one of the most optimistic things about the movies is that through everything that's going on, humanity is in the most basic way, ever so briefly, had a, quote, return to normalcy, so much so that she has the choice to even say no. that she didn't feel pressure to lie, and it seems
right.
as though they really do love each other. But that I think actually that's one of the most important moments of the movie, because it's basically saying again that she, even through all this, she still has a choice. It's not out of pure like, oh, I have to marry you because what else have I got going on? That even when nothing else is going on, she still has the option to say no. I think that's actually
it's also followed up by one of the greatest shots
moment
in movie history of him just like sitting in the bed like after that, almost a zombie in his own way.
Yeah,
but yeah, I've never thought about that way though too. Is that there's still the hope for the future, and even though that doesn't realize itself with them specifically, I find it to be obviously I said a very hopeful movie, and ultimately I guess that kind of covers what we had said about what had changed.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of the production itself. That we had said earlier, he kind of wanted to wait earlier, or wait a little while to make it, but that it was produced by Richard P. Rubenstein, who went on to also produce. This is one of his first big productions that he ever made, and would do Creepshow 2 later on, Day of the Dead. Tales from the Dark Side, that TV show, a show Monsters, and also a lot of Stephen King stuff. Oh, of course, we had said as well, Creepshow, forgot about that, and then Pet Sematary, the Stand TV show, Thinner, The Langoliers. So also he produced the television rights to Dune. He produced some television versions of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm seeing here. And then, he sold the rights to Warner Brothers to make the new Dune movies.
Mm-hmm.
But so, Rubenstein mixed with the Argentos, who of course were big Italian names at the time, also had just come off of and kind of was in the midst of making Suspiria at the time. A very kind of overrated movie, if I may say so myself.
No, I would agree.
But that Giallo movies, the Giallo or Giallo, however you say that.
Giallo,
ultimately, that was in a space of popularity where those movies could be like, oh, we'll fund this thing, right? Which in many ways was already happening in Italy before that, and at the same time, kind of in Europe, these horror movies. But I just do find it very interesting that it's to come back and say with Night of the Living Dead, oh no, we'll fund that, and it was just as big in Italy, because it of course spawned its own share of sequels there. The Zombie, which I've seen the first of those, the Lucio Fulci movie, which is actually pretty good. It's called Zombie 2, and it's sort of a sequel to Dawn of the Dead, but not. It's really confusing. But anyway, that's a pretty good little movie. I just think it's interesting that horror movies in the 70s had become so big in their own way that he felt the allowance to say, okay, I'll take this Italian money and make this. And also that would even, like we said, that would even be possible that these Giallo and Italian interests could kind of fund the movie.
Yeah.
Because I think he went to Rome and wrote the movie, I'm pretty sure. And kind of spent a lot of time there. And obviously the music in the movie from Goblin, which I think is a slightly overrated score. I know that's like a massive...
I would agree with that, though.
Massively beloved score by the band Goblin, who, it should always be noted, let me pull this up, all their different names. Just prepare yourself. It's a lot. The progressive rock band Goblin from Italy. Sorry, the Wi-Fi is loading here. But anyway, there's obviously this whole Italian influence on the movie that is so makes the movie even weirder in its own way. So yeah, the different names. There's like a bunch here. Well, let me see if I can find it, because I used to have all this listed somewhere. Yes, okay. So Goblin, also known as, well, first of all, they recorded as Cherry 5, and then they recorded as other names, Back to the Goblin, New Goblin, Goblin Rebirth, The Goblin Keys, The Goblins, and Claudio Simonetti's Goblin. Just so you know.
I think that's my favorite, Claudio Simonelli's.
Like it's a movie itself. And, of course, the movie also is famous for using a lot of stock music that would go on to inform, and that was partly just because it could use it because it was stock. It was from the DeWolf Music Library. So the movie, it remains, very memorable because it has all these weird aspects that only it being independent could allow. Like if it were more of a Hollywood production, I don't think it would have remained as idiosyncratic and weird. And so yeah, in that way, that I think is a big change from the original movie, is that these foreign influences were more direct. It more as an independent movie, it could still be even more. It could be even more successful, making $66 million off of that's like 100 times the budget, I guess. So
we didn't really say much about it too, but both of these movies have been remade. Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. I think the Dawn of the Dead remake is more known almost than the Night of the Living Dead remake, because Zack Snyder did the Dawn of the Dead one.
Right.
I've seen neither of those movies. I would be more inclined to see Night of the Living Dead remake.
That was a Tom Savini movie,
directed,
right?
Yeah,
that was in the 90s when that was made. Yeah, but yeah, so
I think this would be a good time to talk about. We've talked about it on and off, but just these two movies as a being, as a force. I think what's beautiful about them is that they both are, again, take this metaphor of the zombie, and I think in the reflections of the times they were made are about slightly different things, that it's not the exact same thing. And that it coming from Romero, the same director, you can see a clear progression of ideas. Now, again, I think, like to end this on a very totally dark, nihilistic, not optimistic note in Night of the Living Dead, that Romero realized that, we thought things couldn't get worse at the end of the 60s. Well, they did through much of the 70s, and it was like, well, we're just going to have to make do with what we have, because if we just revel in the
and ultimately the 80s was for domestic policy for white people, essentially a better decade. But that came at all these other costs, and ultimately wasn't.
And this was,
but that was an even more consumerist decade.
Well, I was going to say the 70s was consumerist, but the 80s was even worse.
Right.
So,
and of course, this came around the same time as Carter's crisis of confidence speech, and so
I was thinking about that too in terms of the whole malaise speech, as it's also called, is he was very directly taking issue with this. I don't know if he. I doubt he invited Romero up to the Dawn of the Dead.
Here's my favorite film ever.
My second favorite Romero film
after Monkey Shines, which hadn't even come out at that point. But yeah,
happy birthday, Jimmy Carter. By the way,
is it today?
It was yesterday.
Oh,
I think.
Yesterday. Okay, yeah, he's still with us. Yeah. Thank God.
But I think that this is a lot. It's a lot more obvious than future weeks in terms of what the connections between these movies are, because they're literally from the same filmmaker and 10 years apart, and zombie classics. But I really like that both of these exist, because I think, again, they not only enrich each other, but also they are reflections of the time periods they were made, and kind of you already see how not only horror, but specifically zombies as an idea was progressing over the course of 10 years, and obviously they progressed since this, but not nearly as fast as almost in these 10 years, and so much so that these are, obviously to me, the two definitive zombie films. Just a very, very, very brief preview. We might be touching on one next week. You'll have to wait and see, literally within the next few minutes. But, but everything since these movies have been on the whole, just circling the same drain that these movies were. I think
Return of the Living Dead is pretty good, but is similar to these.
I've honestly not seen 28 Days Later. I would like to see that. I genuinely like Danny Boyle's work, but other than that, a lot of we haven't really mentioned The Walking Dead much. That's been such a huge phenomenon over the last 15 years. But the comic book and the TV series.
That, I think, was at least a necessary occurrence to have a TV version of this and really expand character, I guess. Now, how it always did that, I'm not sure. I've watched some of the first season, and mainly because one time I was sick. I think I was sick with stomach virus randomly around the time of New Year's Eve, and they had this big like New Year's marathon, and I was literally just laying there watching it. And that is a show I've always kind of wanted to return to, watch at least the first few seasons, and then immediately bail out after that.
Yeah.
I actually had a friend in college who was an extra in that show, and is on screen very briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of a necessary occurrence that they had to have the TV show version of that, and to really expand the zombie concept into like that big of a space. But ultimately it's always drawing on these ideas and these things. So
what do you think of, last thing really about Romero, I guess, that we still have movies of his to see. Do you think it's tragic or in a good way befitting for him that he's known as the quote zombie guy as a filmmaker?
Well, it's easy for me because I can just look at it and say, and I'm willing to watch other zombie things sometimes, but I can just look at it and say, yep, that's it. All right.
But you think it's a credit to him that's like, well, he figured all this out as an idea.
Yeah, we've all just been taken from him ever since then. I mean, his other movies are certainly great too, and I think deserve a lot of attention. And Creep Show we've already talked about on here is really good. The Crazies I really like quite a bit. That's kind of very similar to these movies, but it's still good. The Amusement Park, obviously I want to see Season of the Witch and The Dark Half and Night Riders and Monkey Shines and all kinds of other movies.
Jimmy Carter loves it as well.
Right, I mean, we know that already. He called in just a moment ago.
Yeah, you missed it if you skipped ahead.
If you skipped, I don't know why you'd skip ahead, but yeah. But
they're just desperate. What's the next movies? What's the next movies?
Yeah,
like, don't worry,
maybe you'll find out. But yeah, and then ultimately he continued to come back to this, and I think that is sadly just by nature of that's what people wanted him to make because he was so freaking good at doing it, and so that in its own way I think is a credit to him more than it is a curse.
I just think because I think of him, and again as I said earlier, Wes Craven is the quintessential horror auteurs, and I think Wes Craven was both allowed and maybe more interested himself in making different kinds of horror movies.
Yeah.
Inherently more so a little bit than Romero. But I mean, Romero has literally, kind of owned this whole concept for so long that I think he is just now synonymous with zombie film or zombie entertainment in general. So, and I think, obviously, we didn't really talk about this much, but the concept of the zombie preceded him, but obviously what he brought to it was all his own and something that, as you said, we're all still chasing. So that wraps it up for our new format and our new little discussion of both Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. So, Jeff Probst, what have we got next week?
Stay tuned for scenes from our next episode.
Where does it say we should do any one thing but shoot the mothers in the head?
We don't have enough ammunition, Captain, to shoot them all in the head. Time to have done that would have been at the beginning. No, we let them overrun us. They have overrun us, We're in the minority now. Something like 400,000 to 1 by my calculations. I haven't eaten. Is there food?
You were supposed to be here at 7 o'clock sharp, mister.
I know. Sarah told me. I'm sorry I couldn't break away. Is there food?
Listen, egghead, let me bring you up to date on what's been...
Excuse me! Is there food?
I'm running this monkey farm now, Frankenstein, and I want to know what the fuck you're doing with my time!
I do so look forward to us growing old together, sharing the misery of our declining years. Cataracts, uncontrollable halitosis.
Yes, arthritis, kidney stones,
disfiguring medical procedures.
And then,
side by side, hooked up to a myriad life support systems that blink and buzz and drip throughout the night. We writhe in bitter agony until our lives finally draw to a close with a disquieting
What a pairing this is going to be.
Yeah. So obviously Day of the Dead, goes with these. Now, I'll admit, I haven't seen any of the Dead films after this. Like I said, he made, I think it was like Land of the Dead with Dennis Hopper. I think Ving Rhames in that, maybe? No, he was in the remake of Dawn of the Dead. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Land of the Dead. Let's see. That had Simon Baker, Asia Argento, Dennis Hopper, Robert Joy, John Leguizamo, Eugene Clark, is what I was thinking of.
Okay.
But anyway, of course, he made a bunch of other movies after this. He made Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead. But ultimately, Day of the Dead, I always think of as kind of that conclusion to the trilogy.
And he had really big plans for that, right? I mean,
yes, it was supposed to
be
way bigger. It was supposed to have a lot more money.
And there's flashes of what that could have been in the movie itself.
Yeah, he said he wanted to call it the Gone with the Wind of zombie films. Other than it being in the South, in Florida, I don't know what the connection is, but I understand that as a concept. He really was being really ambitious with this. But I actually think that the movie ultimately kind of worked out by being a smaller movie and being only like 140 minutes. An hour and 40 minutes. It's like 100 minutes long. It's like barely longer than Night of the Living Dead, basically.
And I think out of the three that we've talked about between Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and now Day of the Dead, it's the weakest of the three. However, both of those other two are like classics of the genre, so like this to be a little not as good as that is fine. And again, as you said, the scope and ambition of what that movie could have been is still there, and I think the movie still has enough good new ideas in it to make it function on its own. And also that, again, it takes a larger look at the military. And that was something that wasn't really seen or remarked upon.
Right.
Maybe a touch in Dawn of the Dead at the beginning, but on the whole is something that's going to be a new concept that he explores.
Right.
In these
films.
films.
I really like it a lot. I mean, I think Dawn of the Dead is the best one, and Night of the Living Dead is a little better too, but it's not too far behind that, and we'll talk later about it next week, but I think the themes of that, I compare a lot to what you've talked about with, this sounds so random, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, about people being like, oh, what, they're trying to civilize the zombies now, like, how stupid, it's being real hopeful about that, and it's like, what else are we going to do? You know, and it's like...
No, I think that's a worthy concept, I think, to explore.
And the movie's just... It's not as, like, inherently funny as Dawn of the Dead intentionally, but the profanity in the movie and Joe Palacio's character
well, you heard
so
some of his
funny.
monologue.
It's literally one of the funniest performances I've ever seen. It's just like, wow. But,
anyways, enough about these good movies.
Yeah.
Also...
Adam Sandler reunion. Now, let me say, we've been wanting to do this movie ever since this podcast started.
Yeah, this is one of a handful of movies.
To the point where I feel like we should almost do the commentary itself. But we're not going to do that. We're going to do a double feature. Yeah. That's what we're going to do here. So we have seen the Addams Family, the Barry Sonnenfeld Addams Family
Values,
which are actually really quite good.
They're good.
They're like genuinely good movies. I'm impressed by those. They're probably overall the best movies that Sonnenfeld has made, other than Men in Black, the first Men in Black. Nothing after that.
No RV love.
I forgot he made RV. I remember going to. You know what I remember most about RV? Was going to see that movie, and we went to see it up in Lenore at what's now the Golden Ticket Cinema. We went to go see RV. Randomly, the whole time on the screen, there's this like scratch on the screen on the wall, and I kept looking at that the whole movie. Like, they got a scratch on the wall up there. I can see. I remember.
What always gets me about RV,
and I'm like, what will it line up with?
Is there's this like Robin Williams' character is like this. I don't know. He's like a TV executive. I don't even remember what he is. He's like, but there's something at the end where he's like, got to give this pitch to like really save the day. It's what the trip was all about. And his pitch is like this, it feels like it's 25 to 30 seconds long about like, you know, back in the day, everybody used to gather around the TV and watch I Love Lucy every week and blah, blah, blah. And it's such like an impressive thing. And it's like, yeah, we're sold on that. And I remember thinking, even as a kid, like, that's it? Like, what even is this? RV, not all that great. Adam's Family Reunion, though, not directed by Barry Sonnenfeld.
It's a direct-to-video film.
As you were saying, we actually saw those movies. I saw them here and there, but I saw Adam's Family Reunion a lot. Adam's Family Reunion also will be the very first direct-to-video film we're doing on the pod.
By far my favorite Tim Curry product, I must say. Other than stop eating my sesame cake.
I mean, I do like him as the villain in Home Alone 2, but ultimately, it would be
It was directed by Dave Payne. Doesn't even sound like a real name.
98, so it's in
it, of course, stars Daryl Hannah, Tim Curry, and then everybody else. Carol Strucken, Christopher Hart. Literally, the Uncle Fester guy in that is one of the weirdest people I've ever seen.
Also, though,
Estelle Harrison, Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, Ed Begley Jr. is the Dr. Phil.
Ray Walston. That's the first time I ever said Ray Walston in anything.
It was this, and I remember him a little bit in My Favorite Martian.
Yeah,
movie, where he's reprising his role from that
blood-sucking
sycophants.
Sycophants. I'll have the blood-sucking.
But I love that that movie. You know, the other Addams Family movies like takes them and puts them in the quote modern real world to genuinely good funny effects. But this one, it's like, oh, they're like going to a reunion of their like long lost relatives, and like it's like puts them in this like country club aesthetic, which I think
it's like ADAMS, not ADDAMS, and it's like okay, I don't know, but. So ultimately, I think it's actually a good idea for a movie is to be like, oh, let's put them in a family reunion with normal people and then see what happens.
Yeah.
But it's just so bad, ultimately. I mean, we love it, but it's
we were just watching some clips. We have not seen this full thing in probably close to 20 years.
I don't know. It's been about 10, 15.
And I think it's been a little
longer. Well, for
it
you,
would
be maybe a
longer.
little longer.
Wow.
Yeah.
The
memories you just turned 30,
so
it would be longer for you. For me, it hasn't been that long ago. But
wow. Wow. Some of the things I'd just totally forgotten about
you
this
heard
movie.
Some of it
I was
already.
like, but it like brought it all rushing back to me, and I was like, ugh, this. And you know, we might have touched on the Addams. We talked about the Munsters and the Addams Family in the past, I think, a little bit, and
we'll be talking about the Munsters movie on here before.
Probably
next week.
Probably next week, but
we got to get
no
that
promises.
Done.
But
the movie is 2 hours long. Like, are you serious? Like, but anyway.
But you know, as someone who loves like 50s, 60-ish culture, there's certain things it's like, all right, let's move on. Let's move on from this. Like, and I do think that the Sonnenfeld Addams Family movies are good. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But after that, you're like, all right, we're done. And this is like, no, but this.
No, come back. It's like direct to video.
Yeah, and it's
it's specifically a big deal for like Fox and Saban Entertainment, which you said Saban, which had made. I keep saying that Saban Entertainment, which had kind of produced a lot of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers stuff, and it's very 90s. We got a bunch of money. Let's see where it goes. Kind of attitude of just like let's blow.
And this
a bunch
is also
of money,
a contemporary of Dennis the Menace Strikes Again, another direct-to-video.
Casper Meets Wendy,
classic,
kind of similar.
And I mean, this was the era that I saw the most direct-to-video.
Richie Rich's Christmas Wish. I mean, this ultimately was like the 80s had kind of seen that, but especially the 90s was like let's do direct-to-video
sequels,
make a bunch of money.
Disney animated movies had done this too with like Pocahontas or Lion King or Aladdin, these direct-to-video sequels, and so that was popular back then.
So we're gonna eat this up, let me tell you, because we've been wanting to watch this for a long.
We even have the VHS.
Time.
That's how we're gonna watch it.
Yeah, and also we'll talk all about it, but it has the "Coming Addams Family," that whole song
Addams
Family coming at you now, and all that stuff is just like literally. I mean, that's literally like 90s. Let's make some garbage to go along with it, like Bat Dance era, like 10 years. Bat Dance 10 years later, kind of situation. Before we get to that movie though, that next week, I just want to read you the last paragraph. I'm literally not making this up because I forgot this. Yeah. This is the last paragraph of the Wikipedia plot synopsis of Addams Family Reunion. At this point, the firecracker is revealed to have been a nuclear weapon, and the Addams family witness a distant nuclear explosion, apparently caused by it. Morticia comments that a nuclear winter is swiftly approaching and that she feels gloomy. Gomez and Morticia kiss, finishing the movie.
I don't remember
that at all.
Weapon,
but I love also finishing the movie.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, like, cut and dried. That is it kind of attitude.
So literally the Addams family is responsible for a nuclear holocaust. Like,
now I kind of remember that, now that it says that, but literally, like, what? They literally caused a nuclear explosion.
So maybe this really is in keeping with Day of the Dead after all, you know? Is this,
they were more destructive than the zombies were, it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of eating things up, it's time for
Den
time.
Tina, eat. Eat the food. Eat the food!
Someone's come for a nutritious breakfast.
What?
Hello, my name is Boo. Let me finish. Booberry. My ghostly good blueberry-flavored cereal, Booberry, is part of this complete breakfast.
Boo to you, Blueberry.
Frankenberry's got strawberry-flavored marshmallows.
Count Chocula's got chocolate marshmallows.
But I've got blueberry-flavored marshmallows.
Frankenberry. Count Chocula.
And Booberry.
Yeah, sorry, totally lost my train of thought there. But
thankfully, Napoleon Dynamite was there to save the
food.
day. As well as, you just heard a commercial also for Booberry, one of the popular, I don't know, what do you want to call it?
Monster breakfast
breakfast
Now,
cereals,
last year we did Count Chocula, as you might remember. I can't remember what episode we did that with.
Probably towards the end.
I think so. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, might have been Creepshow. I can't remember exactly. Yeah. So, I have tried this years ago.
I don't think I ever have. I don't remember it.
By the way, don't you love how it's always like part of any balanced breakfast? Or like, listen, don't only eat this trash. Like, you know, it's like,
that's a real Madison Avenue way.
Yeah, like,
yeah.
But anyway, it smells like wet dog, so let's see what happens.
All right, here we go.
All right, let's try it out.
Good?
Yeah, pretty good. This one has marshmallows in it, which is a little different than Count Chocula. So, are you much of a cereal person in general?
I usually don't seek cereal out, but every time I eat, I'm like, oh yeah, I should do this more often, and then don't for another 6 to 8 months. You know?
I do like this. It's pretty good.
Now, again, I'm not trying to point out any like weird thing about this. You're somebody you're up for eating cereal without milk. Or milk to the side.
I don't do that as much anymore.
And you felt attacked by the movie Get Out, right?
No.
And what it was implying about you?
I was just like, whatever. I don't feel it's that big of a deal, but yeah, it's funny because with that, it's actually a good time to talk about that. A lot of people are like, oh, because it's like segregation or slavery or whatever implied. Jordan Peele's like, no, I just thought that was weird. So he just kind of came back out and was like, no, that's just kind of a weird thing to do. But no, I actually do eat it with milk now. Not a lot, though. I don't like to have a lot of milk.
It's good.
And that's our show. Kind of like, I don't know what else to say, but yeah, it's good. It's good.
So, come
good
back
stuff.
next week?
Yeah, next week for Day of the Dead and Addams Family Values. No, Addams Family Reunion, excuse me. No, sorry, we're not going to change it to a better movie. Gosh, why would we do that?
Why would we do that? This is Kyle.
This is Levi.
Take care. God bless.
Thank you very much. So nice. Goodbye.